Part 2. The Vale of Aldur. Chapter 7. They were all standing in a circle with their hands joined when they awoke. Tinedra was holding Gerion's left hand, and Dernick was on his right. Gerion's awareness came flooding back as sleep left him. The breeze was fresh and cool, and the morning sun was very bright. Yellow-brown foothills rose directly in front of them, and the haunted plain of Meragor lay behind. Silk looked around sharply as he awoke, his eyes wary. "Where are we?" he asked quickly.
"On the northern edge of Meragor, about 80 leagues east of Torrain."
"And how long were we asleep?"
"A week or so."
Silk kept looking around, adjusting his mind to the passage of time and distance. "Ah, well, I guess it was necessary," he conceded finally. Hetar went immediately to check the horses, and Barak began massaging the back of his neck with both hands.
"I feel as if I've been sleeping on a pile of rocks."
"Walk around a bit. That will work the stiffness out," Aunt Paul advised. Tinedra had not removed her hand from Gerion's, and he wondered if he should mention it to her. Her hand felt very warm and small in his, and on the whole it was not unpleasant. He decided not to say anything about it. Hetar was frowning when he came back.
"One of the pack mares is with Belgariad." "How long has she got to go?"
Wolf asked, looking quickly at him.
"It is hard to say for sure. No more than a month. It is her first."
"Oh, we can break down her pack and distribute the weight among the other horses," Dernick suggested. "She'll be all right if she doesn't have to carry anything."
"Maybe,"
Hetar sounded dubious. Munderallen had been studying the yellowed foothills directly ahead.
"We are being watched, Belgariad," he said somberly, pointing at several wispy columns of smoke rising toward the blue morning sky.
Mr. Wolf squinted at the smoke and made a sour face.
"Yes, gold hunters, probably. They hover around the borders of Meragor like vultures over a sick cow. Take a look, Paul."
But Aunt Paul's eyes already had that distant look in them as she scanned the foothills ahead. "Arens," she said. "Sendars, Tolnedrans, a couple of Drasnians. Oh, they're not very bright."
"Any Mergos?"
"No."
Common rabble, then," Munderallen observed. "Such scavengers will not impede us significantly."
"I'd like to avoid a fight, if possible," Wolf told him.
"These incidental skirmishes are dangerous, and they don't really accomplish anything."
He shook his head with disgust.
"We'll never be able to convince them that we are not carrying gold out of Meragor, though. So I guess there's no help for it."
"If gold is all they want, why don't we just give them some?" Silk suggested.
"I didn't bring all that much with me, Silk."
"It doesn't have to be real," Silk said, his eyes bright. He went to one of the pack horses, came back with several large pieces of canvas, and quickly cut them into foot-wide squares. Then he took one of the squares and laid a double handful of gravel in the center. He pulled up the corners and wrapped a stout piece of cord around them, forming a heavy-looking pouch. He hefted it a few times. "Looks about like a sack full of gold, wouldn't you say?"
"He's going to do something clever again," Barak said.
Silk smirked at him, and quickly made up several more pouches. "I'll take the lead," he said, hanging the pouches on their saddles. "Just follow me, and let me do the talking. How many of them are up there, Belgara?" "About 20, she replied. "Oh, that will work out just fine," he stated confidently. "Shall we go?" They mounted their horses and started across the ground toward the broad mouth of a dry wash that opened out onto the plain. Silk rode at the front, his eyes seemingly everywhere. As they entered the mouth of the wash, Gerion heard a shrill whistle and saw several furtive movements ahead of them. He was very conscious of the steep banks of the wash on either side of them. "I'm going to need a bit of open ground to work with," Silk told them. "There." He pointed with his chin at a spot where the slope of the bank was a bit more gradual. When they reached the spot, he turned his horse sharply. "Now!" he barked. "Ride!" They followed him. Scrambling up the bank and kicking up a great deal of gravel, a thick cloud of choking yellow dust rose into the air as they clawed their way up out of the wash. Shouts of dismay came from the scrubby thorn bushes at the upper end of the wash, and a group of rough-looking men broke out into the open, running hard up through the knee-high brown grass to head them off. A black-bearded man, closer and more desperate than the rest, jumped out in front of them, brandishing a rust-pitted sword. Without hesitation, Mandaralan rode him down. The black-bearded man howled as he rolled and tumbled beneath the churning hooves of the huge war-horse. When they reached the hilltop above the wash, they gathered in a tight group. "This will do," Silk said, looking around at the rounded terrain. "All I need is for the mob to have enough room to think about casualties. I definitely want them to be thinking about casualties." An arrow buzzed toward them, and Mandaralan brushed it almost contemptuously out of the air with his shield. "Hey, stop!" one of the brigands shouted. He was a lean, pock-faced Sindar with crude bandages wrapped round one leg, wearing a dirty green tunic. "Who says so?" Silk yelled back insolently. "On Crowldor," the bandaged man announced importantly. "Crowldor the robber. You've probably heard of me." "I can't say that I have," Silk replied pleasantly. "Leave your gold, and your women," Crowldor ordered. "Maybe I'll let you live." "If you get out of our way, maybe we'll let you live." "I've got 50 men," Crowldor threatened. "All desperate like me." "You've got 20, Silk corrected. "Runaway serfs, cowardly peasants, and sneak thieves. My men are trained warriors. Not only that, we're mounted, and you are on foot." "Leave your gold," the self-proclaimed robber insisted. "Why don't you come and take it?" "Let's go," Crowldor barked at his men. He lunged forward. A couple of his outlaws rather hesitantly followed him through the brown grass, but the rest hung back, eyeing Mandaralan, Barak, and Hetar apprehensively. After a few paces, Crowldor realized that his men were not with him. He stopped and spun around. "You cowards!" he raged. "If we don't hurry, the others are going to get here. We won't get any of the gold then." "I'll tell you what, Crowldor, we are in kind of a hurry, and we've got more gold than we can conveniently carry." He unslung one of his bags of growl from his saddle and shook it suggestively. "Here." Negligently, he tossed the bag into the grass off to one side. Then he took another bag and tossed it over beside the first. At his quick gesture, the others all threw their bags on the growing heap. "There you are, Crowldor. 10 bags of good yellow gold that you can have without a fight. If you want more, you'll have to bleed for it." The rough-looking men behind Crowldor looked at each other and began moving to either side, their eyes fixed greedily on the heap of bags lying in the tall grass. "Your men are having thoughts about mortality, Crowldor," Silk said dryly. "There's enough gold there to make them all rich, and rich men don't take unnecessary risks." Crowldor glared at him. "I won't forget this," he growled. "Oh, I'm sure you won't. We're coming through now. I suggest that you get out of our way." Barak and Hetar moved up to flank Mandaralan, and the three of them started deliberately forward at a slow, menacing walk. Crowldor, the robber, stood his ground until the last moment, then turned and scurried out of their path, spouting curses. "Let's go," Silk snapped. They thumped their heels to their horses' flanks and charged through at a gallop. Behind them, the outlaws circled and then broke and ran toward the heap of canvas bags. Several ugly little fights broke out almost immediately, and 3 men were down before anyone thought to open one of the bags. The howls of rage could be heard quite clearly for some distance. Barak was laughing when they finally reined in their horses after a couple of miles of hard riding.
"Poor Crowldor,"
he chortled.
"You are an evil little man, Silk."
"Oh, I've made a study of the baser side of man's nature," Silk replied innocently. "I can usually find a way to make it work for me." "Crowldor's men are going to blame him for the way things turned out." I know. But then, that's one of the hazards of leadership."
"They might even kill him,"
Hetar observed. "Oh, I certainly hope so. I'd be terribly disappointed in them if they didn't." They pushed on through the yellow foothills for the rest of the day and camped that night in a well-concealed little canyon where the light from their fire would not betray their location to the brigands who infested the region. The next morning, they started out early, and by noon they were in the mountains. They rode on up among the rocky crags, moving through a thick forest of dark green firs and spruces where the air was cool and spicy. Although it was still summer in the lowlands, the first signs of autumn had begun to appear at the higher elevations. The leaves on the underbrush had begun to turn, the air had a faint, smoky haze, and there was frost on the ground each morning when they awoke. The weather held fair, however, and they made good time. Then, late one afternoon, after they had been in the mountains for a week or more, a heavy bank of clouds moved in from the west, bringing with it a damp chill. Geryon untied his cloak from the back of his saddle and pulled it around his shoulders as he rode, shivering as the afternoon grew colder. Dernick lifted his face and sniffed at the air.
"I will have snow before morning," he predicted.
Geryon could also smell the chill, dusty odor of snow in the air. He nodded glumly. Mr. Wolf grunted.
"I knew this was too good to last,"
and then shrugged.
"Oh, well, we have all lived through winters before."
When Geryon poked his head out of the tent the next morning, an inch of snow lay on the ground beneath the dark firs. Soft flakes were drifting down, settling soundlessly and concealing everything more than 100 yards away in a filmy haze. The air was cold and gray, and the horses, looking very dark under a dusting of snow, stamped their feet and flicked their ears at the fairy touch of the snowflakes settling on them. Their breath steamed in the damp cold. Tenedra emerged from the tent she shared with Aunt Paul with a squeal of delight. Snow, Geryon realized, was probably a rarity in Tolhanath, and the tiny girl romped through the soft, drifting flakes with a childish abandon. He smiled tolerantly until a well-aimed snowball caught him in the side of the head. Then he chased her, pelting her with snowballs while she dodged in and out among the trees, laughing and squealing. When he finally caught her, he was determined to wash her face with the snow, but she exuberantly threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, her cold little nose rubbing against his cheek and her eyelashes thick with snowflakes. He didn't realize the full extent of her deceitfulness until she had already poured a handful of snow down the back of his neck. Then she broke free and ran toward the tents, hooting with laughter, while he tried to shake the snow out of the back of his tunic before it all melted. By midday, however, the snow on the ground had turned to slush, and the drifting flakes had become a steady, unpleasant drizzle. They rode up a narrow ravine under its dripping firs, while a torrent-like stream roared over boulders beside them. Mr. Wolf finally called a halt.
"We're getting close to the western border of Tormurgos. I think it's time we started to take a few precautions."
"I will ride out in front,"
Hetar offered quickly.
"I don't think that's a very good idea," Wolf replied. "You tend to get distracted when you see Murgos."
"I'll do it," Silk said. He had pulled his hood up, but water still dripped from the end of his long, pointed nose. "I'll stay about 1/2 mile ahead, and keep my eyes open."
Wolf nodded. "Whistle if you see anything."
"Right," Silk said as he started off up the ravine at a trot. Late that afternoon, the rain began to freeze as it hit, coating the rocks and trees with grey ice. They rounded a large outcropping of rock and found Silk waiting for them. The stream had turned to a trickle, and the walls of the ravine had opened out onto the steep sides of the mountain. "We've got about an hour of daylight left," the little man said. "What do you think? Should we go on, or do you want to drop back down the ravine a bit and set up for the night?" Mr. Wolf squinted at the sky and then at the mountainside ahead. The steep slope was covered with stunted trees, and the timberline lay not far above them.
"We have to go around this, and then down the other side. It's only a couple of miles. Let's go ahead."
Silk nodded and led out again. They rounded the shoulder of the mountain and looked down into a deep gorge that separated them from the peak they had crossed 2 days before. The rain had slackened with the approach of evening, and Geryon could see the other side of the gorge clearly. It was no more than half a mile away, and his eyes caught a movement near the rim. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. Mr. Wolf brushed the ice out of his beard.
"I was afraid of that."
"What?"
"It's an Algroth."
With a shudder of revulsion, Geryon remembered the scaly, goat-faced apes that had attacked them in Arindia. "Hadn't we better run, then?"
"It can't get to us," Wolf replied. "The gorge is at least a mile deep. The Grolums have turned their beasts loose, though. It is something we're going to have to watch out for."
He motioned for them to continue. Faintly, distorted by the wind that blew perpetually down the yawning gorge, Geryon could hear the barking yelps of the Algroth on the far side, as it communicated with the rest of its pack. Soon a dozen of the loathsome creatures were scampering along the rocky rim of the gorge, barking to one another and keeping pace with the party as they rode around the steep mountain face toward a shallow draw on the far side. The draw led away from the gorge. After a mile, they stopped for the night in the shelter of a grove of scrubby spruce. It was colder the next morning, and still cloudy, but the rain had stopped. They rode on back down toward the mouth of the draw and continued following the rim of the gorge. The face on the other side fell away in a sheer, dizzying drop for thousands of feet to the tiny-looking ribbon of the river at the bottom. The Algroths still kept pace with them, barking and yelping and looking across with a dreadful hunger. There were other things as well, dimly seen back among the trees on the other side. One of them, huge and shaggy, seemed even to have a human body, but its head was the head of a beast. A herd of swift-moving animals galloped along the far rim, manes and tails tossing.
"Look!"
Tinidra exclaimed, pointing.
"Wild horses!"
"Those are not horses,"
Hetar said grimly.
"They look like horses."
"They may look like it, but they are not."
"Hrulgin," Mr. Wolf said shortly.
"What is that?"
"A hrulga is a four-legged animal, like a horse, but it has fangs instead of teeth, and clawed feet instead of hooves."
"But that would mean—"
the princess broke off, her eyes wide.
"Yes, they are meat-eaters."
She shuddered.
"How dreadful!"
"That gorge is getting narrower, Belgarath," Barak growled. "I'd rather not have any of those things on the same side with us. We'll be all right. As I remember, it narrows down to about 100 yards, and then widens out again. They won't be able to get across. I hope your memory hasn't failed you."
The sky above looked ragged, tattered by a gusty wind. Vultures soared and circled over the gorge, and ravens flapped from tree to tree, croaking and squawking to one another. Aunt Paul watched the birds with a look of stern disapproval, but said nothing. They rode on. The gorge grew narrower, and soon they could see the brutish faces of the Algroths on the other side clearly. When the Hrulgan, manes tossing in the wind, opened their mouths to whinny to each other, their long pointed teeth were plainly visible. Then, at the narrowest point of the gorge, a party of mail-shirted Murgos rode out onto the opposite precipice. Their horses were lathered from hard riding, and the Murgos themselves were gaunt-faced and travel-stained. They stopped and waited until Garion and his friends were opposite them. At the very edge, staring first across the gorge and then down at the river far below, stood Brill. "What capture?" Silk called in a bantering tone that had a hard edge just below the surface. "We thought, perhaps, you had gotten lost."
"Not very likely, Keldar. How did you get across to that side?"
"Oh, you go back that way about 4 days' ride," Silk shouted, pointing back the way they had come. "If you look very carefully, you'll find the canyon that leads up here. Oh, it shouldn't take you more than a day or two to find it." One of the Murgos pulled a short bow out from beneath his left leg and set an arrow to it. He pointed the arrow at Silk, drew back the string, and released it. Silk watched the arrow calmly as it fell down into the gorge, spinning in a long, slow-looking spiral. "Nice shot," he called.
"Don't be an idiot,"
Brill snapped at the Murgo with the bow. He looked back at Silk.
"I've heard a great deal about you, Keldar," he said.
"Oh, and has developed a certain reputation," Silk replied modestly.
"One of these days, I'll have to find out if you are as good as they say."
"That particular curiosity could be the first symptom of a fatal disease."
"For one of us, at least."
"I look forward to our next meeting, then," Silk told him. "I hope you'll excuse us, my dear fellow. Pressing business, you know."
"Keep an eye out behind you, Keldar," Brill threatened. "One day, I will be there."
"I always keep an eye out behind me, Cordar," Silk called back. "So don't be too surprised if I'm waiting for you. It's been wonderful chatting with you. We'll have to do it again. Soon." The Murgo with the bow shot another arrow. It followed his first into the gorge. Silk laughed and led the party away from the brink of the precipice. "What a splendid fellow," he said, as they rode away. He looked up at the murky sky overhead, and what an absolutely beautiful day. The clouds thickened and grew black as the day wore on. The wind picked up until it howled among the trees. Mr. Wolf led them away from the gorge which separated them from Brill and his Murgos, moving steadily toward the northeast. They set up for the night in a rock-strewn basin just below the timberline. Aunt Paul prepared a meal of thick stew. As soon as they had finished eating it, they let the fire go out.
"There's no point in lighting beacons for them,"
Wolf observed.
"They can't get across the gorge, can they? It is still better not to take any chances."
Wolf walked away from the last few embers of the dying fire and looked out into the darkness. On an impulse, Garion followed him. "How much farther is it to the Vale, grandfather?"
"About 70 leagues. We can't make very good time up here in the mountains."
Yes, and the weather's getting worse, too."
"I noticed that."
"What happens if we get to a real snowstorm?"
"We take shelter until it blows over."
"What if—"
"Garion, I know it's only natural, but sometimes you sound a great deal like your aunt. She's been saying 'what if' to me since she was about 17. I have gotten terribly tired of it over the years."
"I'm sorry."
"Don't be sorry. Just don't do it any more."
Overhead in the pitch blackness of the blustery sky, there was a sudden ponderous flap, as of enormous wings. "What's that?" Garion asked, startled.
"Be still."
Wolf stood, with his face turned upward. There was another great flap.
"Oh, that's sad."
"What?"
"I thought the poor old brute had been dead for centuries. Why don't they leave her alone?"
"What is it?"
"It doesn't have a name. It's big, stupid, and ugly. The gods only made 3 of them, and the two males killed each other during the first mating season. She's been alone for as long as I can remember."
"It sounds huge," Geryon said, listening to the enormous wings beating overhead as he peered up into the darkness. "What does it look like?"
"She's as big as a house, and you really would not want to see her."
"Is she dangerous?"
Very dangerous. But she can't see too well at night. The Grottums must have chased her out of her cave and put her to hunting for us. Oh, sometimes they go too far."
"Should we tell the others about her?"
"No, it would only worry them. Sometimes it is better not to say anything."
The great wings flapped again, and there was a long, despairing cry from the darkness. It was a cry filled with such aching loneliness that Geryon felt a great surge of pity welling up in him. Wolf sighed again.
"There's nothing we can do. Come, let's go back to the tents."
Chapter 8. The weather continued raw and unsettled as they rode for the next 2 days up the long, sloping rise toward the snow-covered summits of the mountains. The trees became sparser, more stunted as they climbed, and finally disappeared entirely. The ridgeline flattened out against the side of one of the mountains, and they rode up into a steep slope of tumbled rock and ice where the wind scoured continually. Mr. Wolf paused to get his bearings, looking around in the pale afternoon light.
"That way,"
he said finally, pointing back. A saddleback stretched between the two peaks, and the sky beyond roiled in the wind. They rode up the slope, their cloaks pulled tightly about them. Hettar came forward with a worried frown on his hawk face.
"That pregnant mare is in trouble. I think her time is getting close."
Without a word, Aunt Paul dropped back to look at the mare, and her face was grave when she returned. "She is no more than a few hours away, Father."
Wolf looked around. "There's no shelter on this side." "Maybe there will be something on the other side of the pass,"
Barak suggested, his beard whipping in the wind. Wolf shook his head.
"I think it's the same as this side. We are going to have to hurry. We don't want to spend the night up here."
As they rode higher, occasional spits of stinging sleet pelted them, and the wind gusted even stronger, howling among the rocks. As they crested the slope and started through the saddle, the full force of the gale struck at them, driving a tattered sleet squall before it.
"It's even worse on this side, Belgariad," Barak shouted over the wind. "How far is it down to the trees?"
"Miles," Wolf replied, trying to keep his flying cloak pulled around him.
"The mare will never make it," Hettar said. "We have got to find shelter." "There isn't any. Not until we get to the trees. It's all bare rock and ice up here."
Without knowing why he said it, not even aware of it until he spoke, Geryon made a shouted suggestion. "What about the cave?" Mr. Wolf turned and looked sharply at him.
"What cave? Where?"
"The one on the side of the mountain. It's not far." Geryon knew the cave was there, but he did not know how he knew.
"Are you sure?"
"Of course. It's this way." Geryon turned his horse and rode up the slope of the saddle toward the vast craggy peak on the left. The wind tore at them as they rode, and the driving sleet half blinded them. Geryon moved confidently, however. For some reason every rock about them seemed absolutely familiar, though he could not have said why. He rode just fast enough to stay in front of the others. He knew they would ask questions, and he didn't have any answers. They rounded a shoulder of the peak and rode out onto a broad rock ledge. The ledge curved along the mountainside, disappearing into a swirling sheet of sleet ahead of them.
"Where art thou taking us, lad?" Mandorallan shouted to him.
"It's not much farther," Geryon yelled back over his shoulder. The ledge narrowed as it curved around the looming granite face of the mountain. Where it bent around a jutting cornice, it was hardly more than a footpath. Geryon dismounted and led his horse around the cornice. The wind blasted directly into his face as he stepped around the granite outcropping, and he had to put his hand in front of his face to keep the sleet from blinding him. Walking that way, he did not see the door until it was almost within reach of his hands. The door in the face of the rock was made of iron, black and pitted with rust and age. It was broader than the gate at Faldor's farm, and the upper edge of it was lost in the swirling sleet. Barak, following close behind him, reached out and touched the iron door. Then he banged on it with his huge fist. The door echoed hollowly.
"There is a cave,"
he said back over his shoulder to the others.
"I thought that the wind had blown out the boy's senses."
"How do we get inside?"
Hethar shouted, the wind snatching away his words.
"The door's as solid as this mountain itself,"
Barak said, hammering with his fists again.
"We have got to get in out of this wind,"
Aunt Paul declared, one of her arms protectively about Sinedra's shoulders.
"Well, Geryon?"
Mr. Wolf asked.
"It's easy,"
Geryon replied.
"I just have to find the right spot."
He ran his fingers over the icy iron, not knowing just what he was looking for. He found a spot that felt a little different.
"Here it is."
He put his right hand on the spot and pushed lightly. With a vast, grating groan, the door began to move. A line that had not even been visible before suddenly appeared like a razor cut down the precise center of the pitted iron surface, and flakes of rust showered from the crack to be whipped away in the wind. Geryon felt a peculiar warmth in the silvery mark on the palm of his right hand where it touched the door. Curious, he stopped pushing. But the door continued to move, swinging open, it seemed, almost in response to the presence of the mark on his palm. It continued to move even after he was no longer touching it. He closed his hand, and the door stopped moving. He opened his hand, and the door, grating against the stone, swung open even wider.
"Don't play with it, dear,"
Aunt Paul told him.
"Just open it."
It was dark in the cave beyond that huge door. It seemed not to have the musty smell that it should have had. They entered cautiously, feeling at the floor carefully with their feet.
"Just a moment,"
Dernick murmured in a strangely hushed voice. They heard him unbuckling one of his saddlebags, and then heard the rasp of his flint against steel. There were a few sparks, then a faint glow, as the smith blew on his tinder. The tinder flamed, and he set it to the torch he had pulled from his saddlebag. The torch sputtered briefly, then caught. Dernick raised it, and they all looked around at the cave. It was immediately evident that the cave was not natural. The walls and floor were absolutely smooth, almost polished, and the light of Dernick's torch reflected back from the gleaming surfaces. The chamber was perfectly round, and about 100 feet in diameter. The walls curved inward as they rose, and the ceiling high overhead seemed also to be round. In the precise center of the floor stood a round stone table, 20 feet across, with its top higher than Barak's head. A stone bench encircled the table. In the wall, directly opposite the door, was a circular arch of a fireplace. The cave was cool, but it did not seem to have the bitter chill that it should have had.
"Is it all right to bring in the horses?"
Hethar asked quietly. Mr. Wolf nodded. His expression seemed bemused in the flickering torchlight, and his eyes were lost in thought. The horses' hooves clattered sharply on the smooth stone floor as they were led inside, and they looked around, their eyes wide and their ears twitching nervously.
"There's a fire laid in here,"
Dernick said from the arched fireplace.
"Shall I light it?"
Wolf looked up.
"What? Oh, yes, go ahead."
Dernick reached into the fireplace with his torch, and the wood caught immediately. The fire swelled up very quickly, and the flames seemed inordinately bright. Sinedra gasped.
"The walls! Look at the walls!"
The light from the fire was somehow being refracted through the crystalline structure of the rock itself, and the entire dome began to glow with a myriad of shifting colors, filling the chamber with a soft, multi-hued radiance. Hettar had moved around the circle of the wall and was peering into another arched opening.
A spring. This is a good place to ride out a storm.
Dernick put out his torch and pulled off his cloak. The chamber had become warm almost as soon as he had lighted the fire. He looked at Mr. Wolf.
You know about this place, don't you? None of us has ever been able to find it before,
the old man replied, his eyes still thoughtful.
We weren't even sure that it still existed.
Oh, what a strange cave this is. Belgariad, what is it?
Mr. Wolf took a deep breath.
When the gods were making the world, it was necessary for them to meet from time to time to discuss what each of them had done, and was going to do, so that everything would fit together and work in harmony. The mountains, the winds, the seasons, and so on.
He looked around.
This is the place where they met.
Silk, his nose twitching with curiosity, had climbed up onto the bench surrounding the huge table.
There are bowls up here, 7 of them, and 7 cups.
There seems to be some kind of fruit in the bowls. He began to reach out with one hand.
Silk,
Mr. Wolf told him sharply.
Don't touch anything.
Silk's hand froze, and he looked back over his shoulder at the old man, his face startled.
You'd better come down from there,
Wolf said gravely.
The door!
Tsinedra exclaimed. They all turned in time to see the massive door gently swinging closed. With an oath, Barak leaped toward it, but he was too late. Booming hollowly, it clanged shut just before his hands reached it. The big man turned, his eyes filled with dismay.
It's all right, Barak. I can open it again,
Geryon told him. Wolf turned then and looked at Geryon, his eyes questioning.
How did you know about this cave?
Geryon floundered helplessly.
I don't know. I just did. I think I've known we were getting close to it for the last day or so.
Does it have anything to do with the voice that spoke to Mara?
I don't think so. He doesn't seem to be there just now, and my knowing about the cave seemed to be different somehow. I think it came from me, not him, but I'm not sure how. For some reason, it seems that I've always known this place was here, only I didn't think about it until we started to get near it. It's awfully hard to explain it exactly.
Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf exchanged a long glance. Wolf looked as if he were about to ask another question, but just then there was a groan at the far end of the chamber.
"Somebody, help me!"
Hettar called urgently. One of the horses, her sides distended and her breath coming in short, heaving gasps, stood swaying as if her legs were about to give out from under her. Hettar stood at her side, trying to support her.
"She is about to fall."
They all turned then, and went quickly to the laboring mare. Aunt Paul immediately took charge of the situation, giving orders crisply. They eased the mare to the floor, and Hettar and Dernick began to work with her, even as Aunt Paul filled a small pot with water and set it carefully on the fire.
"I'll need some room,"
she told the rest of them pointedly, as she opened the bag which contained her jars of herbs.
"Why don't we all get out of your way?"
Barak suggested, looking uneasily at the gasping horse.
"Splendid idea," she agreed. "Tsinedra, you stay here. I will need your help."
Geryon, Barak, and Mandorlan moved a few yards away and sat down, leaning back against the glowing wall, while Silk and Mr. Wolf went off to explore the rest of the chamber. As he watched Dernick and Hettar with the mare, and Aunt Paul and Tsinedra by the fire, Geryon felt strangely abstracted. The cave had drawn him, there was no question of that, and even now it was exerting some peculiar force on him. Though the situation with the mare was immediate, he seemed unable to focus on it. He had a strange certainty that finding the cave was only the first part of whatever it was that was happening. There was something else he had to do, and his abstraction was in some way a preparation for it.
It is not an easy thing to confess, Manderallen was saying somberly.
Geryon glanced at him.
In view of the desperate nature of our quest, however, the knight continued, I must openly acknowledge my great failing. It may come to pass that this flaw of mine shall in some hour of great peril cause me to turn and flee like the coward I am, leaving all your lives in mortal danger.
You're making too much of it.
Nay, my lord, I urge that you consider the matter closely to determine if I am fit to continue on our enterprise.
He started to creak to his feet.
Where are you going?
Barak asked him.
I thought to go apart, so that you may freely discuss the matter.
Oh, sit down, Manderallen. I'm not going to say anything behind your back that I would not say to your face.
The mare, lying close to the fire with her head cradled in Hetar's lap, groaned again.
Is that medicine almost ready, Belgariad?
The Algar asked in a worried voice.
Not quite,
she replied. She turned back to Tinedra, who was carefully grinding up some dried leaves in a small cup with the back of a spoon.
Break them up a little finer, dear.
Dernick was standing astride the mare, his hands on her distended belly.
We may have to turn the foal. I think it's trying to come out wrong way.
Don't start on that until this has a chance to work,
Aunt Paul told him, slowly tapping a grayish powder from an earthen jar into her bubbling pot. She took the cup of leaves from Tinedra, and added that as well, stirring as she poured.
I think, my lord Barak, that thou hast not fully considered the import of what I have told thee.
I heard you. You said you were afraid once. It is nothing to worry about. It happens to everybody now and then.
But I cannot live with it. I live in constant apprehension, never knowing when it will return to unman me.
Dernick looked up from the mare.
You're afraid? Of being afraid? He asked in a puzzled voice. You cannot know what it is like, my good friend, Manderallen replied. Your stomach tightened up, Dernick told him. Your mouth was dry, and your heart felt as if someone had his fist clamped around it, right?
Manderallen blinked.
It's happened to me so often that I know exactly how it feels.
Thou?
Thou art among the bravest men I have ever known.
Dernick smiled wryly.
I'm an ordinary man, Manderallen. Ordinary men live in fear all the time. Didn't you know that? We're afraid of the weather. We're afraid of powerful men. We're afraid of the night and the monsters that lurk in the dark. We're afraid of growing old and of dying. Sometimes we're even afraid of living. Ordinary men are afraid almost every minute of their lives. How can you bear it? Do we have any choice? Fear's a part of life, Manderallen, and it's the only life we've got. You'll just have to get used to it. After you've put it on every morning like an old tunic, you won't even notice it anymore. Sometimes laughing at it helps. A little. Laughing? It shows the fear that you know it's there. But that you're going to go ahead and do what you have to do anyway.
Dernick looked down at his hands, carefully kneading the mare's belly.
Some men curse and swear and bluster. Well, that does the same thing, I suppose. Every man has to come up with his own technique for dealing with it. Personally, I prefer laughing. Seems more appropriate somehow.
Manderallen's face became gravely thoughtful as Dernick's words slowly sank in.
I will consider this. It may be, good friend, that I will owe thee more than my life for thy gentle instruction.
Once more the mare groaned, a deep, tearing sound, and Dernick straightened and began rolling up his sleeves.
The foal's going to have to be turned, Mistress Paul, he said decisively, and soon, or we'll lose this foal and the mare both.
Let me get some of this into her first, she replied,
quenching her boiling pot with some cold water. "Hold her head," she told Hettar. Hettar nodded and firmly wrapped his arms around the laboring mare's head. "Geryon," Aunt Paul said, as she spooned the liquid between the mare's teeth, "why don't you and Sinedra go over there where Silk and your grandfather are?"
"Have you ever turned a foal before, Dunnick?" "Not a foal, but calves many times. Horse isn't that much different from a cow, really."
Barak stood up quickly. His face had a slight greenish cast to it.
"I'll go with Geryon and the princess," he rumbled. "I don't imagine I'd be much help here."
"And I will join thee,"
Mandaralan declared. His face was also visibly pale.
"It were best, I think, to leave our friends ample room for their midwifery."
Aunt Paul looked at the two warriors, a slight smile on her face, but said nothing. Geryon and the others moved rather quickly away. Silk and Mr. Wolf were standing beyond the huge stone table, peering into another of the circular openings in the shimmering wall. "I have never seen fruits exactly like those," the little man was saying.
"I'd be very surprised if you had,"
Wolf replied. "They look as fresh as if they had just been picked." Silk's hand moved almost involuntarily toward the tempting fruit.
"I wouldn't,"
Wolf warned. "I wonder what they taste like."
"Wondering won't hurt you. Tasting might."
"I hate an unsatisfied curiosity."
"You'll get over it."
Wolf turned to Geryon and the others.
"How is the horse?" "Dunnick says he's going to have to turn the foal. We thought it might be better if we all got out of the way."
Wolf nodded.
"Silk,"
he admonished sharply, not turning around. "Oh, sorry." Silk snatched his hand back.
"Why don't you just get away from there? You're only going to get yourself into trouble."
Silk shrugged. "I do that all the time, anyway."
"Just do it, Silk," Wolf told him firmly. "I cannot watch over you every minute."
He slipped his fingers up under the dirty and rather ragged bandage on his arm, scratching irritably.
"That is enough of that," he declared. "Geryon, take this thing off of me."
He held out his arm. Geryon backed away. "Not me," he refused. "Do you know what Aunt Paul would say to me if I did that without her permission?"
"Don't be silly. Silk, you do it."
"First you say to stay out of trouble, and then you tell me to cross Belgariad? You are very inconsistent, Belgariad." "Oh, here," Sinedra said. She took hold of the old man's arm and began picking at the knotted bandage with her tiny fingers. "Just remember, this was your idea. Geryon, give me your knife." Somewhat reluctantly, Geryon handed over his dagger. The princess sawed through the bandage and began to unwrap it. The splints fell clattering to the stone floor.
"What a dear child you are."
Mr. Wolf beamed at her and began to scratch at his arm with obvious relief. "Just remember that you owe me a favor," she told him.
"She is Tonedrin, all right," Silk observed.
It was about an hour later when Aunt Paul came around the table to them, her eyes somber. "How's the mare?" Sinedra asked quickly. "Very weak. But I think she will be all right." "And what about the baby horse?" Aunt Paul sighed. "We were too late. We tried everything, but we just could not get him to start breathing." Sinedra gasped, her little face suddenly a deathly white. "You're not going to just give up, are you?" She said it almost accusingly. "There's nothing more we can do, dear," Aunt Paul told her sadly. "It took too long. He just didn't have enough strength left." Sinedra stared at her, unbelieving. "Do something," she demanded. "You're a sorceress. Do something." "I am sorry, Sinedra.
That's beyond our power. We cannot reach beyond that barrier."
The little princess wailed then and began to cry bitterly. Aunt Paul put her arms comfortingly about her and held her as she sobbed. But Geryon was already moving. With absolute clarity he now knew what it was that the cave expected of him, and he responded without thinking, not running or even hurrying. He walked quietly around the stone table toward the fire. Hettar sat cross-legged on the floor with the unmoving colt in his lap, his head bowed with sorrow and his mane-like scalp lock falling across the spindle-shanked little animal's silent face.
"Give him to me, Hettar."
"Geryon, no!" Aunt Paul's voice, coming from behind him, was alarmed. Hettar looked up, his hawk face filled with deep sadness.
"Let me have him, Hettar,"
Geryon repeated, very quietly. Wordlessly, Hettar raised the limp little body, still wet and glistening in the firelight, and handed it to Geryon. Geryon knelt and laid the foal on the floor in front of the shimmering fire. He put his hands on the tiny rib cage and pushed gently.
"Breathe,"
he almost whispered.
"We tried that, Geryon. We tried everything."
Geryon began to gather his will.
"Don't do that, Geryon,"
Aunt Paul told him firmly.
"It isn't possible. You'll hurt yourself if you try."
Geryon was not listening to her. The cave itself was speaking to him too loudly for him to hear anything else. He focused his every thought on the wet, lifeless body of the foal. Then he stretched out his right hand, laid his palm on that unblemished, walnut-colored shoulder of the small, dead animal. Before him there seemed to be a blank wall, black and higher than anything else in the world, impenetrable, silent, beyond his comprehension. Tentatively he pushed at it, but it would not move. He drew in a deep breath and hurled himself entirely into the struggle.
"Live,"
he said.
"Geryon, stop!"
"Live," he said again, throwing himself deeper into his effort against that blackness.
"It's too late now, Paul,"
he heard Mr. Wolf say from somewhere.
"He has already committed himself."
"Live," Geryon repeated, and the surge he felt welling up out of him was so vast that it drained him utterly. The glowing walls flickered, and then suddenly rang, as if a bell had been struck somewhere deep inside the mountain. The sound shimmered, filling the air inside the domed chamber with a vibrant ringing. The light in the walls suddenly flared with a searing brightness, and the chamber was as bright as noon. The little body under Geryon's hand quivered, and the colt drew in a deep, shuddering breath. Geryon heard the others gasp as the stick-like little legs began to twitch. The colt inhaled again, and his eyes opened.
"A miracle,"
Manderallen said in a choked voice.
"Perhaps even more than that,"
Mr. Wolf replied, his eyes searching Geryon's face. The colt struggled, his head wobbling weakly on his neck. He pulled his legs under him and began to struggle to his feet. Instinctively he turned to his mother and tottered toward her to nurse. His coat, which had been a deep, solid brown before Geryon had touched him, was now marked on the shoulder with a single, incandescently white patch exactly the size of the mark on Geryon's palm. Geryon lurched to his feet and stumbled away, pushing past the others. He staggered to the icy spring bubbling in the opening in the wall and splashed water over his head and neck. He knelt before that spring, shaking, breathing hard for a very long time. Then he felt a tentative, almost shy touch on his elbow. When he warily raised his head, he saw the now steadier colt standing at his side and gazing at him with adoration in its liquid eyes. Chapter 9. The storm blew itself out the next morning. But they stayed in the cave for another day after the wind had died down to allow the mare to recover and the newborn colt to gain a bit more strength. Geryon found the attention of the little animal disturbing. It seemed that no matter where he went in the cave, those soft eyes followed him, and the colt was continually nuzzling at him. The other horses also watched him with a kind of mute respect. All in all, it was a bit embarrassing. On the morning of their departure, they carefully removed all of the traces of their stay in the cave. The cleaning was spontaneous, neither the result of some suggestion or of any discussion, but rather was something in which they all joined without comment.
"The fire's still burning,"
Dernick fretted, looking back into the glowing dome from the doorway as they prepared to leave.
"It will go out by itself after we leave," Wolf told him. "I don't think you could put it out anyway, no matter how hard you tried."
Dernick nodded soberly.
"You're probably right."
"Close the door, Geryon," Aunt Paul said, after they had led their horses out onto the ledge outside of the cave. Somewhat self-consciously, Geryon took hold of the edge of the huge iron door and pulled it. Although Barak with all of his great strength had tried, without success, to budge the door, it moved easily as soon as Geryon's hand touched it. A single tug was enough to set it swinging gently closed. The two solid edges came together with a great hollow boom, leaving only a thin, nearly invisible line where they met. Mr. Wolf put his hand lightly on the pitted iron, his eyes far away. Then he sighed once, turned and led them back along the ledge the way they had come 2 days before. Once they had rounded the shoulder of the mountain, they remounted and rode on down through the tumbled boulders and patches of rotten ice to the first low bushes and stunted trees a few miles below the pass. Although the wind was still brisk, the sky overhead was blue, and only a few fleecy clouds raced by, appearing strangely close. Geryon rode up to Mr. Wolf and fell in beside him. His mind was filled with confusion by what had happened in the cave, and he desperately needed to get things straightened out. "Grandfather?"
"Yes, Geryon,"
the old man answered, rousing himself from his half-doze. "Why did Aunt Paul try to stop me? With the colt, I mean."
"Because it was dangerous. Very dangerous."
"Why dangerous?"
"When you try to do something that's impossible, you can pour too much energy into it. And if you keep trying, it can be fatal."
"Fatal?"
Wolf nodded. "You can drain yourself out completely, and you don't have enough strength left to keep your own heart beating."
"I didn't know that."
Geryon was shocked.
Wolf ducked as he rode under a low branch.
Obviously."
"Don't you keep saying that nothing is impossible?"
"Within reason, Geryon. Within reason."
They rode on quietly for a few minutes, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the thick moss covering the ground under the trees. "Maybe I had better find out more about all of this," Geryon said finally.
"That's not a bad idea. What was it you wanted to know?"
"Everything, I guess."
Mr. Wolf laughed. "That would take a very long time, I'm afraid."
Geryon's heart sank. "Is it that complicated?"
"No, actually it's very simple. But simple things are always the hardest to explain."
"That doesn't make any sense," Geryon retorted, a bit irritably.
"Oh?"
Wolf looked at him with amusement.
"Let me ask you a simple question, then. What's 2 and 2?
"4," Geryon replied promptly.
"Why?"
Geryon floundered for a moment. "It just is," he answered lamely.
"But why?"
"There isn't any why to it, it just is."
"There's a why to everything, Geryon."
"All right. Why is 2 and 2 4, then?"
"I don't know. I thought maybe you might."
They passed a dead snag standing twisted and starkly white against the deep blue sky. "Are we getting anywhere?" Geryon asked, even more confused now.
Actually, I think we have come a very long way, Wolf replied. Precisely what was it you wanted to know?
Geryon put it as directly as he knew how. What is sorcery?
I told you that once already. The will and the word.
That doesn't really mean anything, you know.
All right, try it this way. Sorcery is doing things with your mind instead of your hands. Most people don't use it because at first it's much easier to do things the other way. Geryon frowned.
It doesn't seem hard.
That's because the things you have been doing have come out of impulse. You never sat down and thought your way through something. No, you just do it, don't you?
Well, isn't it easier that way? What I mean is, why not just do it and not think about it?
Because spontaneous sorcery is just third-rate magic, completely uncontrolled. Anything can happen if you simply turn the power of your mind loose. It has no morality of its own. The good or the bad of it comes out of you, not out of the sorcery.
You mean when I burned Asherak, it was me and not the sorcery?
Geryon asked, feeling a bit sick at the thought.
Mr. Wolf nodded gravely.
It might help if you remember that you were also the one who gave life to the colt. The two things sort of balance out.
Geryon glanced back over his shoulder at the colt, who was frisking along behind him like a puppy. What you're saying is that it can't be either good or bad.
No, Wolf corrected. By itself it has nothing to do with good or bad. And it won't help you in any way to make up your mind how to use it. You can do anything you want to with it. Almost anything, that is. You can bite the tops off all of the mountains, or stick the trees in the ground upside down, or turn all of the clouds green if you feel like it. What you have to decide is whether you should do something, not whether you can.
You said almost anything.
I'm getting to that.
Wolf looked thoughtfully at the low-flying cloud above them, an ordinary-looking old man in a rusty tunic and gray hood, looking at the sky.
There's one thing that is absolutely forbidden. You can never destroy anything. Not ever.
Geryon was baffled by that. I destroyed Asherak, didn't I?
No, you killed him. There is a difference. You set fire to him, and he burned to death. To destroy something is to try to uncreate it. That is what is forbidden.
What would happen if I did try?
Your power would turn inward on you, and you would be obliterated in an instant.
Geryon blinked and then suddenly went cold at the thought of how close he had come to crossing that forbidden line in his encounter with Asherak. How do I tell the difference? He asked in a hushed voice. I mean, how do I go about explaining that I only meant to kill someone and not destroy him?
It's not a good area for experimentation, Wolf told him. If you really want to kill somebody, stick your sword in him. Hopefully, you won't have the occasion to do that sort of thing too often.
They stopped at a small brook trickling out of some mossy stones to allow the horses to drink.
You see, Geryon, Wolf explained, the ultimate purpose of the universe is to create things. It won't permit you to come along behind it uncreating all of the things it went to so much trouble to create in the first place. When you kill somebody, all you've really done is alter him a bit. You have changed him from being alive to being dead. He's still there. To uncreate him, you have to will him out of existence entirely. When you feel yourself on the verge of telling something to vanish or go away, or be not, you're getting very close to the point of self-destruction. That's the main reason we have to keep our emotions under control all of the time.
I didn't know that.
You do now. Don't even try to unmake a single pebble.
A pebble?
The universe doesn't make any distinction between a pebble and a man.
The old man looked at him somewhat sternly.
Your aunt has been trying to explain the necessity for keeping yourself under control for several months now, and you have been fighting her every step of the way.
Geryon hung his head.
I didn't know what she was getting at,
he apologized. That's because you were not listening. It's a great failing of yours, Geryon.
Geryon flushed.
What happened the first time you found out you could, well, do things?
He asked, wanting to change the subject. It was something silly, Wolf replied. Usually is, the first time.
What was it?
Wolf shrugged. I wanted to move a big rock. My arms and back were not strong enough, but my mind was. After that, I didn't have any choice but to learn to live with it, because once you unlock it, it is unlocked forever. That's the point where your life changes, and you have to start learning to control yourself.
It always gets back to that, doesn't it?
Always. It's not as difficult as it sounds, really. Look at Mander Allen.
He pointed at the knight, who was riding with Dernick. The two of them were deep in discussion.
Now, Mander Allen's a nice enough fellow, honest, sincere, toweringly noble. But let's be honest. His mind has never been violated by an original thought. Until now. He is learning to control fear, and learning to control it is forcing him to think. Probably for the first time in his whole life. It is painful for him, but he is doing it. If Mander Allen can learn to control fear with that limited brain of his, surely you can learn the same kind of control over the other emotions. After all, you are quite a bit brighter than he is.
Silk, who had been scouting ahead, came riding back to join them.
Belgariad, there is something about a mile in front of us that I think you had better take a look at.
All right, Wolf replied. Think about what I've been saying, Geryon. We will talk more about it later.
Then he and Silk moved off through the trees at a gallop. Geryon pondered what the old man had told him. The one thing that bothered him the most was the crushing responsibility his unwanted talent placed upon him. The colt frisked along beside him, galloping off into the trees from time to time, and then rushing back, his little hooves pattering on the damp ground. Frequently he would stop and stare at Geryon, his eyes full of love and trust.
"Oh, stop that,"
Geryon told him. The colt scampered away again. Princess Zenedra moved her horse up until she was beside Geryon.
"What were you and Belgariad talking about?"
Geryon shrugged.
"A lot of things."
There was immediately a hard little tightening around her eyes. In the months that they had known each other, Geryon had learned to catch those minute danger signals. Something warned him that the princess was spoiling for an argument, and with an insight that surprised him, he reasoned out the source of her unspoken belligerence. What had happened in the cave had shaken her badly, and Zenedra did not like to be shaken. To make matters even worse, the princess had made a few coaxing overtures to the colt, obviously wanting to turn the little animal into her personal pet. The colt, however, ignored her completely, fixing all of his attention on Geryon, even to the point of ignoring his own mother unless he was hungry. Zenedra disliked being ignored even more than she disliked being shaken. Glumly, Geryon realized how small were his chances of avoiding a squabble with her.
"I certainly wouldn't want to pry into a private conversation," she said tartly. "Oh, it wasn't private. We were talking about sorcery and how to keep accidents from happening. I don't want to make any more mistakes."
She turned that over in her mind, looking for something offensive in it. His mild answer seemed to irritate her all the more.
"I do not believe in sorcery,"
she said flatly. In the light of all that had recently happened, her declaration was patently absurd, and she seemed to realize that as soon as she said it. Her eyes hardened even more. Geryon sighed. "All right," he said with resignation. "Was there anything in particular you wanted to fight about, or did you just want to start yowling and sort of make it up as we go along?" "Yowling?" Her voice went up several octaves. "Yowling?" "Screeching, maybe?" he suggested, as insultingly as possible. As long as the fight was inevitable anyway, he determined to get in a few digs at her before her voice rose to the point where she could no longer hear him. "Screeching!" she screeched. The fight lasted for about a quarter of an hour before Barak and Aunt Paul moved forward to separate them. On the whole, it was not very satisfactory. Geryon was a bit preoccupied, too much so to put his heart into the insults he flung at the tiny girl, and Zenedra's irritation robbed her retorts of their usual fine edge. Toward the end, the whole thing had degenerated into a tedious repetition of "spoiled brat," "stupid peasant," echoing endlessly back from the surrounding mountains. Mr. Wolf and Silk rode back to join them.
"What was all of that yelling about?"
"The children were playing," Aunt Paul replied, with a withering look at Geryon. "Where's Hettar?" Silk asked.
"Right behind us,"
Barak said. He turned to look back toward the pack horses, but the tall Algar was nowhere to be seen. Barak frowned.
"He was just there. Maybe he stopped for a moment to rest his horse or something."
"Without saying anything? Oh, that's not like him. And it's not like him to leave the pack horses unattended."
"He must have had some good reason,"
Dernick said.
"I'll go back and look for him."
"No," Mr. Wolf told Barak. "Wait a few minutes.
Let's not get scattered all over these mountains. If anybody goes back, we all go back."
They waited. The wind stirred the branches of the pines around them, making a mournful sighing sound. After several moments, Aunt Paul let out her breath almost explosively. "He's coming." There was a steely note in her voice. "He's been entertaining himself." From far back up the trail, Hettar appeared in his black leather clothing, riding easily at a loping canter with his long scalp-lock flowing in the wind. He was leading two saddled but riderless horses. As he drew nearer, they could hear him whistling rather tunelessly to himself.
"What have you been doing?"
Barak demanded.
"There were a couple of Murgos following us,"
Hettar replied, as if that explained everything.
"You might have asked me to go along,"
Barak said, sounding a little injured. Hettar shrugged.
"There were only two. They were riding Algar horses, so I took it rather personally."
"It seems that you are always finding some reason to take it personally where Murgos are concerned," Aunt Paul said crisply.
"Yes, it does seem to work out that way, doesn't it?"
"Didn't it occur to you to let us know where you were going?"
"There were only two. I did not expect to be gone for very long."
She drew in a deep breath, her eyes flashing dangerously.
"Let it go, Paul,"
Mr. Wolf told her. "But—"
"You're not going to change him, so why excite yourself about it? Besides, it is just as well to discourage pursuit."
The old man turned to Hettar, ignoring the dangerous look Aunt Paul leveled at him.
"Were the Murgos some of those who were with Brill?"
Hettar shook his head.
"No. Brill's Murgos were from the south, and they were riding Murgo horses. These two were northern Murgos."
"Is there a visible difference?"
Mandaralan asked curiously.
"Their armor is slightly different, and the southerners have flatter faces. They are not quite so tall."
"Where did they get Algar horses?"
"They are herd raiders,"
Hettar answered bleakly.
"Algar horses are valuable in tall Murgos, and certain Murgos make a practice of creeping down into Algeria on horse-stealing expeditions. We try to discourage that as much as possible."
"These horses aren't in very good shape,"
Dernick observed, looking at the two weary-looking animals that Hettar was leading.
"They've been ridden hard.
Whip cuts all over them.
Hettar nodded grimly.
That is another reason to hate the Murgos. Did you bury them?
No. I left them, where any other Murgo who might be following can find them. I thought it might help to educate any who come along later.
There are some signs that others have been through here, too. I found the tracks of a dozen or so up ahead, Sulk told them.
It was to be expected, I suppose,
Mr. Wolf commented, scratching at his beard.
Tutchik's got his Grolums out in force. Tar Ugus is probably having the region patrolled. I'm sure they'd like to stop us if they could. I think we should move on down into the Vale as fast as possible. Once we are there, we won't be bothered any more.
Won't they follow us down into the Vale, then?
Dernick asked, looking around nervously.
No. Murgos won't go into the Vale. Not for any reason. Aldur's spirit is there, and the Murgos are desperately afraid of him.
How many days to the Vale?
4, maybe 5, if we ride hard.
We had better get started, then, said Silk. Chapter 10. The weather, which had seemed on the brink of winter in the high mountains, softened back into autumn as they rode down from the peaks and ridges. The forest in the hills above Maragor had been thick with fir and spruce and heavy undergrowth. On this side, however, the dominant tree was the pine, and the undergrowth was sparse. The air seemed drier, and the hillsides were covered with high yellow grass. They passed through an area where the leaves on the scattered bushes were bright red. Then, as they moved lower, the foliage turned first yellow, then green again. Gerion found this reversal of the seasons strange. It seemed to violate all of his perceptions of the natural order of things. By the time they reached the foothills above the Vale of Aldur, it was late summer again, golden and slightly dusty. Although they frequently saw evidences of the Murgo patrols which were crisscrossing the region, they had no further encounters. After they crossed a certain undefined line, there were no more tracks of Murgo horses. They rode down beside a turbulent stream which plunged over smooth, rounded rocks, frothing and roaring. The stream was one of several forming the headwaters of the Aldur River, a broad flow running through the vast Algerian plain to empty into the Gulf of Kerek, 800 leagues to the northwest. The Vale of Aldur was a valley lying in the embrace of the two mountain ranges which formed the central spine of the continent. It was lush and green, covered with high grass and dotted here and there with huge solitary trees. Deer and wild horses grazed there, as tame as cattle. Skylarks wheeled and dove, filling the air with their song. As the party rode out into the valley, Gerion noticed that the birds seemed to gather wherever Aunt Paul moved, and many of the braver ones even settled on her shoulders, warbling and trilling to her in welcome and adoration.
I had forgotten about that, Mr. Wolf said to Gerion. It's going to be difficult to get her attention for the next few days.
Oh?
Every bird in the Vale is going to stop by to visit her. Happens every time we come here. The birds go wild at the sight of her.
Out of the welter of confused bird sound, it seemed to Gerion that faintly, almost like a murmuring whisper, he could hear a chorus of chirping voices repeating Polgara, Polgara, Polgara. Is it my imagination, or are they actually talking?
I'm surprised you haven't heard them before, Wolf replied. Every bird we've passed for the last 10 leagues has been babbling her name.
Look at me, Polgara, look at me, a swallow seemed to say, hurling himself into a wild series of swooping dives around her head. She smiled gently at him, and he redoubled his efforts. I've never heard them talk before.
They talk to her all the time. Sometimes they go on for hours. That's why she seems a little abstracted sometimes. She's listening to the birds. Your aunt moves through a world filled with conversation.
I didn't know that.
Well, not many people do.
The colt, who had been trotting rather sedately along behind Geryon, as they had come down out of the foothills, went wild with delight when he reached the lush grass of the vale. With an amazing burst of speed, he ran out over the meadows. He rolled in the grass, his thin legs flailing. He galloped in long, curving sweeps over the low, rolling hills. He deliberately ran at herds of grazing deer, startling them into flight and then plunging along after them. "Come back here!" Geryon shouted at him.
"He won't hear you,"
Hettar said, smiling at the little horse's antics.
"At least he will pretend that he doesn't. He's having too much fun."
"Get back here right now." Geryon projected the thought a bit more firmly than he had intended. The colt's forelegs stiffened, and he slid to a stop. Then he turned and trotted obediently back to Geryon, his eyes apologetic. "Bad horse," Geryon chided. The colt hung his head.
"Don't scold him," Wolf said. "You were very young once yourself."
Geryon immediately regretted what he had said and reached down to pat the little animal's shoulder. "It's all right," he apologized. The colt looked at him gratefully and began to frisk through the grass again, although staying close. Princess Tenedra had been watching him. She always seemed to be watching him for some reason. She would look at him, her eyes speculative, and a tendril of her coppery hair coiled about one finger and raised absently to her teeth. It seemed to Geryon that every time he turned around she was watching and nibbling. For some reason he could not quite put his finger on. It made him very nervous. "If he were mine, I would not be so cruel to him," she accused, taking the tip of the curl from between her teeth. Geryon chose not to answer that. As they rode down the valley, they passed 3 ruined towers, standing some distance apart, and all showing signs of great antiquity. Each of them appeared to have originally been about 60 feet high, though weather and the passage of years had eroded them down considerably. The last of the 3 looked as if it had been blackened by some intensely hot fire. "Was there some kind of war here, Grandfather?"
"No," Wolf replied rather sadly. "The towers belonged to my brothers. That one over there was Belsambar's, and the one near it was Belmekor's. They died a long time ago."
"I didn't think sorcerers ever died."
"They grew tired. Or maybe they lost hope. They caused themselves no longer to exist."
"They killed themselves?"
"In a manner of speaking. It was a little more complete than that, though."
Geryon did not press it, since the old man appeared to prefer not to go into the details. "What about the other one? The one that's been burned? Whose tower was that?"
Belzedar's.
"Did you and the other sorcerers burn it after he went over to Torak?"
"No. He burned it himself. I suppose he thought that was a way to show us that he was no longer a member of our brotherhood. Belzedar always liked dramatic gestures."
"Where is your tower?"
Farther on down the vale."
"Will you show it to me?"
"If you like."
"Does Aunt Paul have her own tower?"
"No. She stayed with me while she was growing up, and then we went out into the world. We never got around to building her one of her own."
They rode until late afternoon, and stopped for the day beneath an enormous tree which stood alone in the center of a broad meadow. The tree quite literally shaded whole acres. Tenedra sprang out of her saddle and ran toward the beautiful tree, her deep red hair flying behind her. "It's beautiful!" she exclaimed, placing her hands with reverent affection on the rough bark. Mr. Wolf shook his head.
Dryads. They grow giddy at the sight of trees." "I don't recognize it," Durnix said with a slight frown. "It's not an oak."
"Maybe it's some southern species," Barak suggested. "I've never seen one exactly like it myself."
"Oh, he's very old," Tenedra said, putting her cheek fondly against the tree trunk. "And he speaks strangely, but he likes me."
"What kind of tree is he?"
Dernick asked. He was still frowning, his need to classify and categorize frustrated by this huge tree.
"It's the only one of its kind in the world," Mr. Wolf told him. "I don't think we ever named it. It was always just the tree. We used to meet here sometimes." "It doesn't seem to drop any berries or fruit or seeds of any kind," Dernick observed, examining the ground beneath the spreading branches. "It doesn't need them," Wolf replied. "As I told you, it's the only one of its kind. It's always been here. Always will be. It feels no urge to propagate itself."
Dernick seemed worried about it.
"I've never heard of a tree with no seeds."
"It's a rather special tree, Dernick," Aunt Paul said. "It sprouted on the day the world was made, and it will probably stand here for as long as the world exists. It has a purpose other than reproducing itself."
"Now what purpose is that?"
"We don't know," Wolf answered. "We only know that it's the oldest living thing in the world. Maybe that's its purpose. Maybe it's here to demonstrate the continuity of life." Tenedra had removed her shoes and was climbing up into the thick branches, making little sounds of affection and delight. "Is there by any chance a tradition of linking dryads with squirrels?" Silk asked.
Mr. Wolf smiled. "If the rest of you can manage without us, Geryon and I have something to attend to."
Aunt Paul looked at him questioningly.
"It is time for a little instruction, Paul."
"We can manage, Father. Will you be back in time for supper?"
"Keep it warm for us. Coming, Geryon?"
The two of them rode in silence through the green meadows, with the golden afternoon sunlight making the entire vale warm and lovely. Geryon was baffled by Mr. Wolf's curious change of mood. Always before there had been sort of an impromptu quality about the old man. He seemed frequently to be making up his life as he went along, relying on chance, his wits, and his power, when necessary, to see him through. Here in the vale, he seemed serene, undisturbed by the chaotic events taking place in the world outside. About 2 miles from the tree stood another tower. It was rather squat and round, and was built of rough stone. Arched windows near the top faced out in the directions of the 4 winds, but there seemed to be no door.
"You said you'd like to visit my tower?" Wolf said, dismounting. "This is it."
"It isn't ruined like the others."
"I take care of it from time to time. Shall we go up?"
Geryon slid down from his horse. "Where's the door?"
"Right there."
Wolf pointed at a large stone in the rounded wall. Geryon looked skeptical. Mr. Wolf stepped in front of the stone.
"It's me,"
he said.
"Open."
The surge Geryon felt at the old man's word seemed commonplace, ordinary, a household kind of surge that spoke of something that had been done so often that it was no longer a wonder. The rock turned obediently, revealing a sort of narrow, irregular doorway. Motioning for Geryon to follow, Wolf squeezed through into the dim chamber beyond the door. The tower, Geryon saw, was not a hollow shell as he had expected, but rather was a solid pedestal, pierced only by a stairway winding upward.
"Come along,"
Wolf told him, starting up the worn stone steps.
"You watch that one,"
he said about halfway up, pointing at one of the steps.
"The stone is loose."
"Well, then why don't you fix it?" Geryon asked, stepping up over the loose stone.
"Oh, I've been meaning to, but I just haven't gotten around to it. It's been that way for a long time. I'm so used to it now that I never seem to think of fixing it when I'm here."
The chamber at the top of the tower was round and very cluttered. A thick coat of dust lay over everything. There were several tables in various parts of the room covered with rolls and scraps of parchment, strange-looking implements and models, bits and pieces of rock and glass. and a couple of birds' nests. On one, a curious stick was so wound and twisted and coiled that Gerion's eye could not exactly follow its convolutions. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, trying to trace it out. "What is this, grandfather?"
"That? Oh, it's one of Polgareth's toys," the old man said absently, staring around at the dusty chamber.
"What's it supposed to do?"
"Keep her quiet. When she was a baby, that is. It's only got one end. She spent 5 years trying to figure it out."
Gerion pulled his eyes off of the fascinating, compelling piece of wood. "Well, that's a cruel sort of thing to do to a child?"
"And I had to do something," Wolf answered. "She had a penetrating voice as a child. Daldaran was a quiet, happy little girl, but your aunt never seemed satisfied."
"Beldaran?"
"Your aunt's twin sister."
The old man's voice trailed off, and he looked sadly out of one of the windows for a few moments. Finally, he sighed and turned back to the round room.
"I suppose I ought to clean this up a bit."
He looked again around at the dust and litter. "Let me help," Gerion offered.
"Just be careful not to break anything," the old man warned. "Some of those things took me centuries to make."
He began moving around the chamber, picking things up and setting them down again, blowing now and then on them to clear away a bit of the dust. His efforts didn't really seem to be getting anywhere. Finally he stopped, staring at a low, rough-looking chair with the rail along its back scarred and gashed, as if it had been continually grasped by strong claws. He sighed again. "What's wrong?"
"Poledra's chair," Wolf said. "My wife. She used to perch there and watch me, sometimes for years on end."
"Perch?"
"She was fond of the shape of the owl."
"Oh." Gerion had somehow never thought of the old man as ever having been married, although he obviously had to have been at some time, since Aunt Paul and her twin sister were his daughters. The shadowy wife's affinity for owls, however, explained Aunt Paul's own preference for the shape. The two women, Poledra and Beldaran, were involved rather intimately in his own background, he realized, but quite irrationally he resented them. They had shared a part of the lives of his aunt and his grandfather that he would never, could never know. The old man moved a parchment and picked up a peculiar-looking device with a sighting glass in one end of it.
"I thought I'd lost you," he told the device, touching it with a familiar fondness. "You have been under that parchment all this time?"
"What is it?"
"Yeah, thing I made when I was trying to discover the reason for mountains."
"The reason?"
"Yes, everything has a reason." Wolf raised the instrument. "You see, what you do is—" He broke off and laid the device back on the table. "It's much too complicated to explain. I am not even sure if I remember exactly how to use it myself. I haven't touched it since before Belzadar came to the Vale. When he arrived, I had to lay my studies aside to train him."
He looked around at the dust and clutter.
This is useless. The dust will just come back anyway."
"Were you alone here, before Belzadar came?"
"My master was here. That's his tower over there."
Wolf pointed through the north window at a tall, slender stone structure about a mile away. "Was he really here? I mean, not just his spirit?"
"No, he was really here. That was before the gods departed."
"Did you live here always?"
"No. I came like a thief, looking for something to steal. Well, that's not actually true, I suppose. I was about your age when I came here. I was dying at the time."
"Dying?"
"Freezing to death. I had left the village I was born in the year before, after my mother died, and spent my first winter in the camp of the Godless Ones. They were very old by then."
"Godless ones?"
"Ulgos. or rather the ones who decided not to follow Gorham to Prolgu. They stopped having children after that, so they were happy to take me in. I couldn't understand their language at the time, and all their pampering got on my nerves, so I ran away in the spring. I was on my way back the next fall, but I got caught in an early snowstorm, not far from here. I lay down against the side of my master's tower to die. I did not know it was a tower at first. With all that snow swirling around, it just looked like a pile of rock. As I recall, I was feeling rather sorry for myself at the time.
Well, I can imagine. Garion shivered at the thought of being alone and dying.
Oh, I was a snivelling bit. Sound disturbed my master. He let me in, probably more to quiet me than for any other reason. As soon as I got inside, I started looking for things to steal.
But he made you a sorcerer instead?
No. He made me a servant, a slave. I worked for him for 5 years, before I even found out who he was. Oh, sometimes I think I hated him, but I had to do what he told me to. I didn't really know why. The last straw came when he told me to move a big rock out of his way. I tried with all my strength, but I couldn't budge it. Finally, I got angry enough to move it with my mind instead of my back. That's what he had been waiting for, of course. After that, we got along better. He changed my name from Gareth to Belgariad, and he made me his pupil.
And his disciple?
That took a little longer. I had a lot to learn. I was examining the reason that certain stars fell at the time he first called me his disciple, and he was working on a round grey stone he had picked up by the riverbank.
Did you ever discover the reason? That stars fall, I mean.
Yes. It's not all that complicated. It has to do with balance. The world needs a certain weight to keep it turning. When it starts to slow down, a few nearby stars fall. Their weight makes up the difference.
I never thought of that.
Neither did I. Not for quite some time.
The stone you mentioned, was it?
The orb. Just an ordinary rock until my master touched it. Anyway, I learned the secret of the will and the word, which isn't really that much of a secret after all. It's there, in all of us. Or did I say that before?
I think so.
Probably so. I tend to repeat myself.
The old man picked up a roll of parchment and glanced at it, then lay it aside again.
Oh, so much that I've started and haven't finished.
Grandfather?
Yes, Garion?
This thing of ours, how much can you actually do with it?
That depends on your mind, Garion. The complexity of it lies in the complexity of the mind that puts it to use. Quite obviously, it can't do something that can't be imagined by the mind that focuses it. That was the purpose of our studies, to expand our minds so that we could use the power more fully.
Everybody's mind is different, though.
Garion was struggling toward an idea.
Yes?
Wouldn't that mean that this thing?
He shied away from the word power.
Well, what I mean is it different? Sometimes you do things, and other times you have Aunt Paul do them.
Wolf nodded.
It is different, in each one of us. There are certain things we can all do. We can all move things, for example.
Aunt Paul called it
Garion hesitated, not remembering the word.
Translocation, Wolf supplied. Moving something from one place to another. It is the simplest thing you can do. Usually the thing you do first. And it makes the most noise.
That's what she told me.
Garion remembered the slave he had jerked from the river at Stithistor, the slave who had died.
Polgara can do things that I cannot,
Wolf continued.
Not because she's any stronger than I am, but because she thinks differently than I do. We're not sure how much you can do yet, because we don't know exactly how your mind works. You seem to be able to do certain things quite easily, that I would not even attempt. Maybe it's because you don't realize how difficult they are.
I don't quite understand what you mean.
The old man looked at him. Perhaps you don't at that. Remember the crazy monk who tried to attack you in that village in northern Tornedra, just after we left Orindia?
Geryon nodded.
You cured his madness. It doesn't sound like much until you realize that in the instant you cured him, you had to understand fully the nature of his insanity. That's an extremely difficult thing, and you did it without even thinking about it. And then, of course, there was the colt.
Geryon glanced down through the window at the little horse friskily running through the field surrounding the tower.
The colt was dead, but you made him start to breathe. In order for you to do that, you had to be able to understand death.
It was just a wall. All I did was reach through it.
There's more to it than that, I think. What you seem to be able to do is to visualize extremely difficult ideas in very simple terms. That's a rare gift. But there are some dangers involved in it that you should be aware of.
Dangers? Such as what?
Don't oversimplify. If a man is dead, for example, he is usually dead for a very good reason, like a sword through the heart. If you bring him back, he will only die immediately again anyway. As I said before, just because you can do something does not necessarily mean that you should.
Geryon sighed.
I'm afraid this is going to take a very long time, Grandfather. I have to learn how to keep myself under control. I have to learn what I can't do, so I don't kill myself trying to do something that's impossible. I have to learn what I can do and what I should do. I wish this had never happened to me.
We all do, sometimes. The decision was not ours to make, though. I have not always liked some of the things I've had to do. Neither has your aunt. However, what we are doing is more important than we are, so we do what is expected of us, like it or not.
What if I just said, no, I won't do it?
You could do that, I suppose. But you won't, will you?
Geryon sighed again.
No, I guess not.
The old sorcerer put his arm around the boy's shoulders.
I thought you might see things that way, Belgariad. You're bound to this the same way we all are.
The strange thrill he always felt at the sound of his other secret name ran through Geryon.
Why do you all insist on calling me that?
Belgariad, Wolf said mildly. Think, boy. Think what it means. I haven't been talking to you and telling you stories all of these years just because I like the sound of my own voice.
Geryon turned it over carefully in his mind.
You were Gerath,
he mused thoughtfully.
But the god Aldur changed your name to Belgarath. Zadar was Zadar first and then Belzadar. And then he went back to being Zadar again.
And in my old tribe, Polgara would have just been Gara. Paul is like Bel. The only difference is that she's a woman. Her name comes from mine because she's my daughter. Your name comes from mine, too.
Geryon? Gerath,
the boy said.
Belgarath. Belgarian. It all fits together, doesn't it?
Naturally, the old man replied. I'm glad you noticed it.
Geryon grinned at him,
and then a thought occurred. But I'm not really Belgarian yet, am I?
Not entirely. You still have a way to go.
I suppose I had better get started then,
Geryon said with a certain ruefulness.
Since I don't really have any choice.
Somehow I knew that eventually you'd come around, Mr. Wolf said.
Don't you sometimes wish that I was just Garion again, and you were that old storyteller coming to visit Faldor's farm, with Aunt Paul making supper in the kitchen as she did in the old days, and we were hiding under a haystack with a bottle I'd stolen for you?
Garion felt homesickness welling up in him.
Yes. Sometimes, Garion. Sometimes,
Wolf admitted, his eyes far away.
We won't ever be able to go back there again, will we?
Not the same way, no.
I'll be Belgarian and you'll be Belgarath. We won't even be the same people anymore.
Everything changes, Garion.
Show me the rock,
Garion said suddenly.
Which rock?
The one Aldur made you move, the day you first discovered the power.
Oh, that rock. It's right over there, the white one. The one the colt is sharpening his hooves on.
It's a very big rock.
I'm glad you appreciate that, Belgarath replied modestly. I thought so myself.
Do you suppose that I could move it?
You never know until you try, Garion, Belgarath told him.
Chapter 11. The next morning, when Garion awoke, he knew immediately that he was not alone.
Where have you been?
He asked silently. I've been watching, the other consciousness in his mind said. I see that you have finally come around.
What choice did I have?
None. You'd better get up. Aldur's coming. Garion quickly rolled out of his blankets.
Here? Are you sure?
The voice in his mind did not answer. Garion put on a clean tunic and hose and wiped off his half-boots with a certain amount of care. Then he went out of the tent he shared with Silk and Dernick. The sun was just coming up over the high mountains to the east, and the line between sunlight and shadow moved with a stately ponderousness across the dewy grass of the vale. Aunt Paul and Belgarath stood near the small fire, where a pot was just beginning to bubble. They were talking quietly, and Garion joined them.
You are up early,
Aunt Paul said. She reached out and smoothed his hair.
I was awake,
he replied. He looked around, wondering from which direction Aldur would come.
Your grandfather tells me that the two of you had a very long talk yesterday.
Garion nodded.
I understand a few things a little better now. I'm sorry I've been so difficult.
She drew him to her and put her arms around him.
It's all right, dear. You had some hard decisions to make. You are not angry with me, then? Oh, of course not, dear.
The others had begun to get up, coming out of their tents, yawning and stretching and rumpled-looking.
What do we do today?
Silk asked, coming to the fire and rubbing the sleep from his eyes.
We wait,
Belgarath told him.
My master said he would meet us here.
I'm curious to see him. I've never met a god before.
The curiosity, methinks, will soon be satisfied, Prince Keldar. Look there, Mandaralan said, pointing.
Coming across the meadow, not far from the great tree beneath which they had pitched their tents, a figure in a blue robe was approaching. A soft nimbus of blue light surrounded the figure, and the immediate sense of presence made it instantly clear that what approached was not a man. Garion was not prepared for the impact of that presence. His meeting with the spirit of Issa in Queen Salmisra's throne room had been clouded by the narcotic effects of the things the Serpent Queen had forced him to drink. Similarly, half of his mind had slept during the confrontation with Mara and the ruins of Mar Ammon. But now, fully awake in the first light of morning, he found himself in the presence of a god. Aldur's face was kindly and enormously wise. His long hair and beard were white, from conscious choice. Garion felt rather than from any result of age. The face was very familiar to him somehow. It bore a startling resemblance to Belgarath's, but Geryon perceived immediately, with a sudden curious inversion of his original notion, that it was Belgarath who resembled Aldur. As if their centuries of association had stamped Aldur's features upon the face of the old man. There were differences, of course. That certain mischievous roguishness was not present on the calm face of Aldur. That quality was Belgarath's own, the last remnant, perhaps, of the face of the thieving boy Aldur had taken into his tower on a snowy day some 7,000 years ago.
"Master," Belgarath said, bowing respectfully as Aldur approached.
"Belgarath,"
the god acknowledged.
His voice was very quiet.
"I have not seen thee in some time. The years have not been unkind to thee?"
Belgarath shrugged wryly.
"Some days I feel them more than others, master. I carry a great number of years with me."
Aldur smiled and turned to Aunt Paul.
"My beloved daughter,"
he said fondly, reaching out to touch the white lock at her brow.
"Thou art as lovely as ever."
"And thou as kind, master,"
she replied, smiling and inclining her head. There passed among the three of them a kind of intensely personal linkage, a joining of minds that marked their reunion. Geryon could feel the edges of it with his own mind, and he was somewhat wistful at being excluded, though he realized at once there was no intent to exclude him. They were merely re-establishing an eons-old companionship, shared experiences that stretched back into antiquity. Aldur then turned to look at the others.
"And so, you have come together at last, as it has been foretold from the beginning of days that you should. You are the instruments of destiny, and my blessing goes with each as you move toward that awful day when the universe will become one again."
The faces of Geryon's companions were awed and puzzled by Aldur's enigmatic blessing. Each, however, bowed with profound respect and humility. And then Zenedra emerged from the tent she shared with Aunt Paul. The tiny girl stretched luxuriantly and ran her fingers through the tumbled mass of her flaming hair. She was dressed in a dryad tunic and sandals. "Zenedra?" Aunt Paul called her. "Come here."
"Yes, Lady Polgara,"
the little princess replied obediently. She crossed to the fire, her feet seeming barely to touch the ground. Then she saw Aldur standing with the others and stopped, her eyes wide. "This is our master, Zenedra. He wanted to meet you." The princess stared at the glowing presence in confusion. Nothing in her life had prepared her for such a meeting. She lowered her eyelashes and then looked up shyly, her tiny face artfully and automatically assuming its most appealing expression. Aldur smiled gently.
"She's like a flower that charms without knowing it."
His eyes looked deeply into those of the princess.
"There is steel in this one, however. She is fit for her task. My blessings upon thee, my child."
Zenedra responded with an instinctively graceful curtsy. It was the first time Geryon had ever seen her bow to anyone. Aldur turned then to look full at Geryon. A brief, unspoken acknowledgment passed between the god and the consciousness that shared Geryon's thoughts. There was in that momentary meeting a sense of mutual respect and of shared responsibility. And then Geryon felt the massive touch of Aldur's mind upon his own, and knew that the god had instantly seen and understood his every thought and feeling.
"Hail, Belgariad,"
Aldur said gravely.
"Master,"
Geryon replied. He dropped to one knee, not really knowing why.
"We have awaited thy coming since time's beginning. Thou art the vessel of all our hopes."
Aldur raised his hand.
"My blessing, Belgariad. I am well pleased with thee."
Gerian's entire being was suffused with love and gratitude as the warmth of Aldur's benediction filled him.
"Dear Polgara,"
Aldur said to Aunt Paul,
"thy gift to us is beyond value. Belgariad has come at last, and the world trembles at his coming."
Aunt Paul bowed again.
"Let us now go apart,"
Aldur said to Belgarath and Aunt Paul.
"Your task is well begun, and I must now provide you with that instruction I promised when first I set your steps upon this path. That which once clouded becomes clearer, and we now can see what lies before us. Let us look toward that day that we have all awaited, and make our preparations."
The three of them moved away from the fire, and it seemed to Gerion that as they went, the glowing nimbus which had surrounded Aldur now enclosed Aunt Paul and his grandfather as well. Some movement or sound distracted his eye for a moment, and when he looked back, the three of them had vanished.
Barak let out his breath explosively. "Balar, but that was something to see."
"We have been favored, I think, beyond all men," Mandaralan said.
They all stood staring at each other, caught up in the wonder of what they had just witnessed. Tenedra, however, broke the mood.
"All right,"
she ordered peremptorily.
"Don't just stand there gaping. Move away from the fire."
"What are you going to do?"
"The Lady Polgara is going to be busy,"
the little girl said loftily.
"So I am going to make the breakfast."
She moved toward the fire with a business-like bustling. The bacon was not too badly burned, but Senedra's attempt to toast slices of bread before the open fire turned out disastrously, and her porridge had lumps in it as solid as clods in a sun-baked field. Gerion and the others, however, ate what she offered without comment, prudently avoiding the direct gaze she leveled at them, as if daring them to speak so much as one word of criticism. "I wonder how long that they are going to be," Silk said after breakfast.
"Gods, I think, have little notion of time," Barak replied sagely, stroking at his beard. "I don't expect them back until some time this afternoon at the earliest."
"It is a good time to check over the horses," Hetar decided. "Some of them have picked up a few burrs along the way, and I would like to have a look at their hooves, just to be on the safe side."
"I'll help you," Dernick offered, getting up. Hetar nodded, and the two of them went off to the place where the horses were picketed.
"And I've got a nick or two in my sword edge," Barak remembered, fishing a piece of polishing stone out of his belt and laying his heavy blade across his lap.
Mandaralan went to his tent and brought out his armor. He laid it out on the ground and began a minute inspection for dents and spots of rust. Silk rattled a pair of dice hopefully in one hand, looking inquiringly at Barak.
"If it's all the same to you, I think that I would like to enjoy the company of my money for a while longer," the big man told him.
"Oh, this whole place absolutely reeks of domesticity," Silk complained. Then he sighed, put away his dice, and went to fetch a needle and thread and tunic that he had torn on a bush up in the mountains. Tinedra had returned to her communion with the vast tree, and was scampering among the branches, taking what Gerion felt to be an inordinate risk as she jumped from limb to limb with a cat-like unconcern. After watching her for a few moments, he fell into a kind of reverie, thinking back to the awesome meeting that morning. He had met the gods Asa and Mara already, but there was something special about Aldur. The affinity Belgarath and Aunt Paul showed so obviously for this god, who had always remained aloof from men, spoke loudly to Gerion. The devotional activities of Sindaria, where he had been raised, were inclusive rather than exclusive. A good Sindar prayed impartially, and honored all of the gods, even Torak. Gerion now, however, felt a special closeness and reverence for Aldur, and the adjustment in his theological thinking required a certain amount of thought, A twig dropped out of the tree onto his head, and he glanced up with annoyance. Tenedra, grinning impishly, was directly over his head. "Boy," she said in her most superior and insulting tone, "the breakfast dishes are getting cold. The grease is going to be difficult to wash off if you let it harden." "I'm not your scullion," he told her. "Wash the dishes, Geryon," she ordered him, nibbling at the tip of a lock of hair. "Wash them yourself." She glared down at him, biting rather savagely at the unoffending lock. "Why do you keep chewing on your hair like that?" "What are you talking about?" she demanded, removing the lock from between her teeth. "Every time I look at you, you've got your hair stuck in your mouth." "I do not," she retorted indignantly. "Are you going to wash those dishes?" "No." He squinted up at her. The short dryad tunic she was wearing seemed to expose an unseemly amount of leg. "Why don't you go put on some clothes?" he suggested. "Some of us don't appreciate the way you run around half-naked all of the time." The fight got underway almost immediately after that. Finally, Geryon gave up his efforts to get in the last word and stomped away with disgust. "Geryon," she screamed after him, "don't you dare go off and leave me with all of these dirty dishes." He ignored her and kept walking. After a short distance, he felt a familiar nuzzling at his elbow, and he rather absently scratched the colt's ears. The small animal quivered with delight and rubbed against him affectionately. Then, unable to restrain himself any more, the colt galloped off into the meadow to pester a family of docilely feeding rabbits. Geryon found himself smiling. The morning was just too beautiful to allow the squabble with the princess to spoil it. There was, it seemed, something rather special about the Vale. The world around grew cold with the approach of winter, and was buffeted by storms and dangers. But here, it seemed as if the hand of Aldur stretched protectively above them, filling this special place with warmth and peace, and a kind of eternal and magical serenity. Geryon, at this trying point in his life, needed all of the warmth and peace that he could get. There were things that had to be worked out, and he needed a time, however brief, without storms and dangers to deal with them. He was halfway to Belgariad's tower before he realized that it had been there that he had been going all along. The tall grass was wet with dew, and his boots were soon soaked, but even that did not spoil the day. He walked around the tower several times, gazing up at it. Although he found the stone that marked the door quite easily, he decided not to open it. It would not be proper to go uninvited into the old man's tower, and, beyond that, he was not entirely certain that the door would respond to any voice but Belgariad's. He stopped quite suddenly at that last thought, and started searching back, trying to find the exact instant when he had ceased to think of his grandfather as Mr. Wolf, and had finally accepted the fact that he was Belgariad. The changeover seemed significant, a kind of turning point. Still lost in thought, he turned then and walked across the meadow toward the large white rock the old man had pointed out to him from the tower window. Absently, he put one hand on it and pushed. The rock did not budge. Geryon set both hands on it and pushed again. Nothing happened. He stepped back and considered it. It wasn't really a vast boulder. It was rounded and white, and not quite as high as his waist. Heavy, certainly, but it should not be so inflexibly solid. He bent over to look at the bottom, and then he understood. The underside of this rock was flat. It would never roll. The only way to move it would be to lift one side and tip it over. He walked around the rock, looking at it from every angle. He judged that it was marginally movable. If he exerted every ounce of his strength, he might be able to lift it. He sat down and looked at it, thinking hard. As he did sometimes, he talked to himself, trying to lay out the problem. "Well, the first thing to do is to try to move it," he concluded.
doesn't really look totally impossible. Then, if that doesn't work, we'll try it the other way. He stood up, stepped purposefully to the rock, wormed his fingers under the edge of it, and heaved. Nothing happened. "Have to try a little harder," he told himself. He spread his feet and set himself. He began to lift again, straining, the cords standing out in his neck. For the space of about 10 heartbeats, he tried as hard as he could to lift that stubborn rock, not to roll it over. He had given up on that after the first instant, but simply to make it budge, to acknowledge his existence. Though the ground was not particularly soft there, his feet actually sank as he strained against the rock's weight. Little dots seemed to swirl in front of his eyes as he released the rock and collapsed, gasping against it. He lay against the cold, gritty surface for several minutes, recovering. "All right. Now we know that won't work." He stepped back and sat down. Each time he had done something with his mind before, it had been on impulse, a response to some crisis. He had never sat down and deliberately worked himself up to it. He discovered almost at once that the entire set of circumstances was completely different. The whole world seemed suddenly filled with distractions. Birds sang. A breeze brushed his face. An ant crawled across his hand. Each time he began to bring his will to bear, something pulled his attention away. There was a certain feeling to it. He knew that. A tightness in the back of his head and a sort of pushing out with his forehead. He closed his eyes, and that seemed to help. It was coming. It was slow, but he felt the will beginning to build in him. Remembering something, he reached inside his tunic and put the mark on his palm against the amulet. The force within him, amplified by that touch, built to a great roaring crescendo. He kept his eyes closed and stood up. Then he opened his eyes and looked hard at the stubborn white rock. "You will move," he muttered. He kept his right hand on the amulet and held out his left hand, palm up. "Now," he said sharply, and slowly began to raise his left hand in a lifting motion. The force within him surged, and the roaring sound inside his head became deafening. Slowly, the edge of the rock came up out of the grass. Worms and burrowing grubs who had lived out their lives in the safe, comfortable darkness under the rock flinched as the morning sunlight hit them. Ponderously, the rock raised, obeying Gerion's inexorable lifting hand. It teetered for a second on its edge, then toppled slowly over. The exhaustion he had felt after trying to lift the rock with his back was nothing compared to the bone-deep weariness that swept over him after he let the clenching of his will relax. He folded his arms on the grass and let his head sink down on them. After a moment or two, that peculiar fact began to dawn on him. He was still standing, but his arms were folded comfortably in front of him on the grass. He jerked his head up and looked around in confusion. He had moved the rock, certainly. That much was obvious, since the rock now lay on its rounded top with its damp underside turned up. Something else had also happened, however. Though he had not touched the rock, its weight had none the less been upon him as he had lifted it, and the force he had directed at it had not all gone at the rock. With dismay, Gerion realized that he had sunk up to his armpits in the firm soil of the meadow. "Oh, well, then now what do I do?" he asked himself helplessly. He shuddered away from the idea of once again mustering his will to pull himself out of the ground. He was too exhausted even to consider it. He tried to wriggle, thinking that he might be able to loosen the earth around him and work his way up an inch at a time, but he could not so much as budge. "Look what you've done," he accused the rock. The rock ignored him. A thought occurred to him. "Are you in there?" he asked.
that awareness that seemed always to have been with him. The silence in his mind was profound.
"Help!"
he shouted. A bird, attracted by the exposed worms and bugs that had been under the rock, cocked one eye at him, and then went back to its breakfast. Geryon heard a light step behind him, and craned around, trying to see. The colt was staring at him in amazement. Hesitantly, the small horse thrust out his nose and nuzzled Geryon's face.
"That's a good horse,"
Geryon said, relieved not to be alone, at least. An idea came to him.
"You're going to have to go get Hetar,"
he told the colt. The colt pranced about and nuzzled his face again.
"Oh, stop that,"
Geryon commanded.
"This is serious."
Cautiously he tried to push his mind into the colt's thoughts. He tried a dozen different ways until he finally struck the right combination by sheer accident. The colt's mind flitted from here to there without purpose or pattern. It was a baby's mind, vacant of thought, receiving only sense impressions. Geryon caught flickering images of green grass and running and clouds in the sky and warm milk. He also felt the sense of wonder in that little mind, and the abiding love that the colt had for him. Slowly, painfully, Geryon began constructing a picture of Hetar in the colt's wandering thoughts. It seemed to take forever.
"Hetar,"
Geryon said over and over.
"Go get Hetar. Tell him that I'm in trouble."
The colt scampered around and came back to stick his soft nose in Geryon's ear.
"Please pay attention,"
Geryon cried. "Please." Finally, after what seemed hours, the colt seemed to understand. He went several paces away, then came back to nuzzle Geryon again.
"Go get Hetar,"
Geryon ordered, stressing each word. The colt pawed at the ground, then turned and galloped away, going in the wrong direction. Geryon started to swear. For almost a year now, he had been exposed to some of the more colorful parts of Barak's vocabulary. After he had repeated all of the phrases that he remembered 6 or 8 times, he began to extemporize. A flickering thought came back to him from the now-vanished colt. The little beast was chasing butterflies. Geryon pounded the ground with his fists, wanting to howl with frustration. The sun rose higher, and it started to get hot. It was early afternoon when Hetar and Silk, following the prancing little colt, found him.
"How in the world did you manage to do that?"
Silk asked curiously.
"I don't want to talk about it,"
Geryon muttered, somewhere between relief and total embarrassment.
"He probably can do many things that we cannot,"
Hetar observed, climbing down from his horse and untying Durnik's shovel from his saddle.
"The thing that I do not understand, though, is why he would want to do that."
"Oh, I'm positive he had a good reason for it," Silk assured him. "Do you think we should ask him? It's probably very complicated. I'm sure simple men like you and me would not be able to understand it."
"Do you suppose that he is finished with whatever it is he is doing?"
"Oh, we could ask him, I suppose."
"I would not want to disturb him. It could be very important."
"Oh, it almost has to be."
"Will you please get me out of here?"
Geryon begged. "Are you sure that you're quite finished? We can wait, if you're not done yet."
"Please?"
Geryon asked, almost in tears. Chapter 12.
"Why did you try to lift it?"
Belgariad asked Geryon the next morning, after he and Aunt Paul had returned and Silk and Hetar had solemnly informed them of the predicament in which they had found the young man the afternoon before.
"It seemed like the best way to tip it over,"
Geryon answered.
"You know, kind of get hold of it from underneath and then roll it, sort of."
"Why didn't you just push against it, close to the top? It would have rolled over if you had done it that way."
"I didn't think of that." "Don't you realize that soft earth won't accept that kind of pressure?" Well, I do now, but wouldn't pushing on it have just moved me backward?
You have to brace yourself, Belgarath explained. That's part of the whole trick. As much of your will goes to holding yourself immobile as it does to pushing against the object that you are trying to move. Otherwise, all you do is just shove yourself away.
But I didn't know that. It's the first time I've ever tried to do anything unless it was an emergency. Will you stop that?
He demanded crossly of Senedra, who had collapsed into gales of laughter as soon as Silk had finished telling them about Gerion's blunder. She laughed even harder now.
I think that you are going to have to explain a few things to him, Father. He doesn't seem to have even the most rudimentary idea about the way forces react against each other.
She looked at Gerion critically.
It's lucky you didn't decide to throw it. You might have flung yourself halfway back to Meragor. I really don't think it's all that funny,
Gerion told his friends, who were all grinning openly at him.
Well, it's not as easy as it looks, you know.
He realized that he had just made a fool of himself, and he was not sure if he were more embarrassed or hurt by their amusement.
"Come with me, boy," Belgarath said firmly. "It looks as if we're going to have to start at the very beginning."
Well, it's not my fault. I didn't know. You should have told me.
"I did not know that you were planning to start experimenting so soon," the old man replied. "Most of us have sense enough to wait for guidance before we start rearranging the local geography."
Well, at least I did manage to move it, Gerion said defensively, as he followed the old man across the meadow toward the tower.
"Splendid. Did you put it back the way you found it?"
Why? What difference does it make?
"We don't move things here in the Vale. Everything that's here is here for a reason, and they are all supposed to be exactly where they are."
I didn't know,
Gerion apologized. "You do now. Let's go put it back where it belongs."
They trudged along in silence.
Grandfather,
Gerion said finally.
"Yes?"
When I moved the rock, it seemed that I was getting the strength to do it from all around me. It seemed just to flow in from every place. Does that mean anything?
"That's the way it works," Belgarath explained. "When we do something, we take the power to do it from our surroundings. When you burned Hamdar, for example, you drew the heat from all around you, from the air, the ground, from everyone who was in the area. You drew a little heat from everything to build the fire. When you tipped the rock over, you took the force to do it from everything nearby."
I thought it all came from inside.
"Only when you create things," the old man replied. "That force has to come from within us. For anything else, we borrow. We gather up a little power from here and there and put it all together, and then turn it loose, all at one spot. Nobody's big enough to carry around the kind of force it would take to do even the simplest sort of thing."
Then that's what happens when somebody tries to unmake something?
Gerion said intuitively.
He pulls in all of the force, but then he can't let it go, and it just...
He spread his hands and jerked them suddenly apart. Belgarath looked narrowly at him.
"You've got a strange sort of mind, boy. You understand the difficult things quite easily, but you can't seem to get hold of the simple ones. There's the rock." He shook his head. "Oh, that will never do. Put it back where it belongs, and try not to make so much noise this time. That racket you raised yesterday echoed all over the Vale."
"What do I do?"
"Gather in the force. Take it from everything around." Gerion tried. "Not from me!" the old man exclaimed sharply.
Gerion excluded his grandfather from his field of reaching out and pulling in. After a moment or two he felt as if he were tingling all over, and that his hair was standing on end.
"Now what?"
he asked, clenching his teeth to hold it in.
"Push out behind you, and push at the rock at the same time."
"What do I push at behind me?"
"Everything. And at the rock as well. It has to be simultaneous.
Won't I get sort of squeezed in between?
Tense yourself up.
We'd better hurry, Grandfather, Geryon said. I feel like I'm going to fly apart.
Hold it in. Now, put your will on the rock and say the word.
Geryon put his hands out in front of him and straightened his arms.
Push,
he commanded. He felt the surge and the roaring. With a resounding thud, the rock teetered and then rolled back smoothly to where it had been the morning before. Geryon suddenly felt bruised all over, and he sank to his knees in exhaustion.
Push,
Belgariad said incredulously.
You said to say push.
I said to push. I didn't say to say push.
It went over. What difference does it make what word I used?
It's a question of style,
the old man said with a pained look.
Push sounds so babyish.
Weakly, Geryon began to laugh.
After all, Geryon, we do have a certain dignity to maintain, the old man said loftily. If we go around saying push or flop or things like that, no one's ever going to take us seriously.
Geryon wanted to stop laughing, but he simply couldn't. Belgariad stalked away indignantly, muttering to himself. When they returned to the others, they found that the tents had been struck and the pack-horses loaded. "There's no point in staying here," Aunt Paul told them, "and the others are waiting for us. Did you manage to make him understand anything, Father?" Belgariad grunted, his face set in an expression of profound disapproval. "Things did not go well, I take it?"
"I'll explain later,"
he told her shortly. During Geryon's absence, Tenedra, with much coaxing and a lapful of apples from their stores, had seduced the little colt into a kind of ecstatic subservience. He followed her about shamelessly, and the rather distant look he gave Geryon showed not the slightest trace of guilt. "You're going to make him sick," Geryon accused her. "Apples are good for horses," she replied airily. "Tell her, Hatar."
"They won't hurt him," the hook-nosed man answered. "It is a customary way to gain the trust of a young horse."
Geryon tried to think of another suitable objection, but without success. For some reason, the sight of the little animal nuzzling at Tenedra offended him, though he could not exactly put his finger on why. "Who are these others, Belgariad?" Silk asked as they rode. "The ones Palgara mentioned."
"My brothers," the old sorcerer replied. "Our masters advised them that we are coming."
"I've heard stories about the Brotherhood of Sorcerers all my life. Are they as remarkable as everyone says?" "I think you are in for a bit of a disappointment," Aunt Paul told him rather primly. "For the most part, sorcerers tend to be crotchety old men with a wide assortment of bad habits. I grew up amongst them, so I know them all rather well." She turned her face to the thrush perched on her shoulder, singing adoringly. "Yes," she said to the bird, "I know." Geryon pulled closer to his aunt and began to listen very hard to the bird-song. At first it was merely noise, pretty but without sense. Then, gradually, he began to pick up scraps of meaning, a bit here, a bit there. The bird was singing of nests and small speckled eggs and sunrises, and the overwhelming joy of flying. Then, as if his ears had suddenly opened, Geryon began to understand. Larks sang of flying and singing. Sparrows chirped of hidden little pockets of seeds. A hawk soaring overhead screamed its lonely song of riding the wind alone, and the fierce joy of the kill. Geryon was awed, as the air around him suddenly came alive with words. Aunt Paul looked at him gravely. "It's a beginning," she said, without bothering to explain. Geryon was so caught up in the world that had just opened to him that he did not see the two silvery-haired men at first. They stood together beneath a tall tree, waiting as the party rode nearer. They wore identical blue robes, and their white hair was quite long, though they were clean-shaven. When Geryon looked at them for the first time, he thought for a moment that his eyes were playing tricks. The two were so absolutely identical that it was impossible to tell them apart.
"Belgariad, our brother," one of them said. "It has been such a terribly long time," the other finished.
"Beltira," Belgarath said. "Belkira."
He dismounted and embraced the twins.
"Dearest little Palgara," one of them said then.
"The Vale has been,"
the other started.
"Empty without you,"
the second completed. He turned to his brother.
"That was very poetic,"
he said admiringly.
"Thank you,"
the first replied modestly.
"These are my brothers, Beltira and Belkira,"
Belgarath informed the members of the party, who had begun to dismount.
"Don't bother to try to keep them separate. Nobody can tell them apart anyway."
"We can,"
the two said in unison.
"I am not even sure of that,"
Belgarath responded with a gentle smile.
"Your minds are so close together that your thoughts start with one and finish with the other."
"You have always complicated it so much, Father," Aunt Paul said. "This is Beltira." She kissed one of the sweet-faced old men. "And this is Belkira." She kissed the other. "I have been able to tell them apart since I was a child."
"Belgara knows
all our secrets,"
the twins smiled.
"And who are your companions?"
"I think you'll recognize them," Belgarath answered. "Mandoran, Baron of Omandor."
"The Knight Protector,"
the twins said in unison, bowing.
"Prince Keldar of Dresnia."
"Ah, the Guide," they said.
"Marek, Earl of Trelheim."
"The Dreadful Bear."
They looked at the big Carrack apprehensively. Barak's face darkened, but he said nothing.
"Hetar, son of Kohag of Algeria."
"Ah, the Horse Lord."
"And Durnik of Sundaria."
"The one with 2 lives,"
they murmured with profound respect. Durnik looked baffled at that.
"Genedra, Imperial Princess of Tunedra."
"Ah, Queen of the World,"
they replied, with another deep bow. Sinedra laughed nervously.
"And this can only be Belgarian,"
they said, their faces alive with joy.
"The Chosen One."
The twins reached out in unison and laid their right hands on Geryon's head. Their voices sounded within his mind.
"Hail, Belgarian, Overlord and Champion, Hope of the World."
Geryon was too surprised at this strange benediction to do more than awkwardly nod his head.
"If this gets any more cloying, I think I'll vomit,"
a new voice, harsh and rasping, announced. The speaker, who had just stepped out from behind the tree, was a squat, misshapen old man, dirty and profoundly ugly. His legs were bowed and gnarled like oak trunks. His shoulders were huge, and his hands dangled below his knees. There was a large hump in the middle of his back, and his face was twisted into a grotesque caricature of a human countenance. His straggly iron-gray hair and beard were matted, and the twigs and bits of leaves were caught in the tangles. His hideous face wore an expression of perpetual contempt and anger.
"Belden,"
Belgarath said mildly,
"we weren't sure you would come."
"Yes, I shouldn't have, you bungler,"
the ugly man snapped.
"You've made a mess of things as usual, Belgarath."
He turned toward the twins.
"Get me something to eat,"
he told them peremptorily.
"Yes, Belden,"
they said quickly, and started away.
"And don't be all day about it,"
he shouted after them.
"You seem to be in a good humor today, Belden," Belgarath said, with no trace of sarcasm. "What's made you so cheerful?"
The ugly dwarf scowled at him, then laughed a short, barking sound.
"I saw Belzedar. He looked like an unmade bed. Something had gone terribly wrong for him, and I enjoy that sort of thing."
"Dear Uncle Belden," Aunt Paul said fondly, putting her arms around the filthy little man. "I have missed you so much."
"Don't try to charm me, Belgara," he told her, though his eyes seemed to soften slightly. "This is as much your fault as it is your father's. I thought you were going to keep an eye on him. How did Balthazar get his hands on our master's orb?"
"We think he has used a child," Belgarath answered seriously. "The orb will not strike an innocent."
The dwarf snorted.
"There's no such thing as an innocent. All men are born corrupt."
He turned his eyes back to Aunt Paul and looked appraisingly at her.
"You're getting fat," he said bluntly. "Your hips are as wide as an ox cart."
Dernick immediately clenched his fists and went for the hideous little man. The dwarf laughed, and one of his big hands caught the front of the smith's tunic. Without any seeming effort, he lifted the surprised Dernick and threw him several yards away.
"You can start your second life right now if you want," he growled threateningly.
"Let me handle this, Dernick," Aunt Paul told the smith. "Belden," she said coolly, "how long has it been since you've had a bath?"
The dwarf shrugged. "Rained on me a couple of months ago."
Not hard enough, though. You smell like an uncleaned pigsty."
Belden grinned at her. "That's my girl. I was afraid the years had taken off your edge," he chortled.
The two of them then began to trade the most hair-raising insults that Geryon had ever heard in his life. Graphic, ugly words passed back and forth between them, almost sizzling in the air. Barak's eyes widened in astonishment, and Mandaralan's face blanched often. Zenedra, her face flaming, bolted out of earshot. The worse the insults, however, the more the hideous Belden smiled. Finally, Aunt Paul delivered an epitaph so vile that Geryon actually cringed, and the ugly little man collapsed on the ground, roaring with laughter and hammering at the dirt with his great fists.
"By the gods, I have missed you, Paul," he gasped. "Come here, give us a kiss."
She smiled, kissing his dirty face affectionately. "Mangy dog."
"You big cow,"
he grinned, catching her in a crushing embrace.
"I'll need my ribs more or less in one piece, Uncle," she told him.
"I haven't cracked any of your ribs in years, my girl."
"Yes, and I'd like to keep it that way."
The twins hurried across to the dwarf Belden, carrying a large plate of steaming stew and a huge tankard. The ugly man looked curiously at the plate, then casually dumped the stew on the ground and tossed the plate away.
"It doesn't smell too bad."
He squatted and began to stuff the food into his mouth with both hands, pausing only now and then to spit out some of the larger pebbles that clung to the chunks of meat. When he had finished, he swilled down the contents of the tankard, belched thunderously, and sat back, scratching at his matted hair with his gravy-smeared fingers.
"Now, let's get down to business."
"Where have you been?" Belgarath asked him.
Central Tol Murgos. I've been sitting on a hilltop since the Battle of Omimbre, watching the cave where Belzidar took Torak."
500 years? Silk gasped.
Belden shrugged. "Yes, more or less," he replied indifferently. "Somebody had to keep an eye on Burnt Face, and I wasn't doing anything that couldn't be interrupted."
"You said you saw Belzidar?"
"About a month ago. Came to the cave, as if he had a demon on his tail, pulled Torak out, then he changed himself into a vulture and flew off with the body."
"It must have been right after Tuchek caught him at the Nissen border and took the orb away from him."
"Well, I wouldn't know about that. That was part of your responsibility, not mine. All I was supposed to do was keep watch over Torak. Did any of the ashes fall on you?"
"Which ashes?" one of the twins asked.
"When Belzidar took Torak out of the cave, The mountain exploded. Blew its guts out. I imagine it had something to do with the force surrounding old One-Eye's body. It was still blowing when I left.
We wondered what had caused that eruption. It put ash down an inch deep all over Nyassa.
Good. Too bad it wasn't deeper.
"Did you see any signs of Torek stirring?" the twins asked.
Can't you two ever talk straight?
Belden demanded. "We're sorry."
It's our nature.
The ugly little man shook his head with disgust.
Well, never mind. No, Torek didn't move once in the whole 500 years. There was mold on him when Belzadar dragged him out of that cave.
"Did you follow Belzadar?"
Well, naturally.
"Where did he take Torek?"
Now, where do you think, idiot? To the ruins of Thol Marshrak and Meloria, of course. There are only a few places on Earth that will bear Torek's weight. That's one of them. Belzadar has to keep Tochik and the orb away from Torak. That's the only place he could go. The Melorian Grolums refuse to accept Tuchik's authority, so Belzadar will be safe there. It will cost him a great deal to pay for their aid. But they'll keep Tuchik out of Meloria, unless he raises an army of Murgos and invades.
"There's something we could hope for," Barak said.
You're supposed to be a bear, not a donkey, Belden told him. Don't base your hopes on the impossible. Neither Tuchik nor Belzadar would start that sort of a war at this particular time. Not with Belgariad here stalking through the world like an earthquake.
He scowled at Aunt Paul then.
Can't you teach him to be a little quieter? Or are your wits getting as flabby as you're behind?
"Be civil, Uncle," she replied. "The boy is just coming into his strength. We were all a bit clumsy at first."
He doesn't have time to be a baby, Paul. The stars are dropping into southern Chrol Murgos like poisoned roaches. Dead Grolums are moaning in their tombs from Raktol to Rakhaga. Time is on us. He's got to be ready.
"He will be ready, Uncle."
Maybe,
the filthy old man said sourly. "Are you going back to Tol Mishrak?" Belgarath asked.
No, our master told me to stay here. The twins and I have work to do, and we don't have much time.
"He spoke to us, too."
Stop that,
Belden snapped at the twins. He turned back to Belgarath.
Are you going to Rachtol now?
"Not yet. We've got to go to Prolgu first. I have to talk to the Gurum. And we've got to pick up another member of the party."
Yes, I noticed that your group was not yet complete. What about the last one?
Belgarath spread his hands. "That's the one that worries me. I have not been able to find any trace of her. And I have been looking for 3,000 years.
You spent too much time looking in alehouses."
"I noticed the same thing, Uncle,"
Aunt Paul said with a sweet little smile. "Where do we go after Prolgu?" Barak wanted to know. "I think that then we will go to Rachtol," Belgarath replied rather grimly. "We have got to get that orb back from Tuchik. And I have been meaning to have a rather pointed discussion with that magician of the Murgos for a long time now."